Hello there and welcome to Life Beyond Scene, where curiosity slows down, the world becomes a little quieter, and true stories are told with care rather than haste. Tonight, we are going to the Yorkshire Dales, to a place of limestone, open moorland, cold water, and a cave system whose name still carries weight among people who understand the underground world. This is the story of Mossdale Cave, more often called Mossdale Caverns, and of the tragedy that changed caving forever. It is not a story told for shock. It is not a story to turn danger into entertainment. It is a story about people, weather, risk, rescue, memory, and the way one terrible day can reshape the habits of an entire community. So, settle in gently. Let the room around you become still. Let your shoulders drop a little, if they have been doing that thing shoulders do, where they quietly move up toward your ears without asking permission. Tonight's subject is serious, but we will move through it slowly, clearly and respectfully, with enough calm space to understand what happened and why it mattered. Before we step toward the cave entrance, I would love to know where you are listening from tonight. Are you somewhere near hills, rain, stone walls and low clouds? Or are you far away from the Dales entirely, maybe in a warm room with a window open, or under a blanket while the rest of the house has gone quiet? And when you hear the word cave, what comes to mind first? Is it adventure, darkness, science, danger, childhood curiosity, or the strange feeling that the ground beneath our feet has another world hidden inside it? There is something very human about that feeling. Most of us live our lives on the surface. We walk along pavements, fields, kitchens, train platforms and supermarket aisles, all very certain that down means simply floor, soil or foundation. But in limestone country, down can mean passages, streams, chambers, and narrow spaces shaped over thousands and thousands of years. Under an ordinary hillside, there may be a route that only a few people have ever seen. It is quite a thought, really. You might be standing in the rain with muddy boots and a slightly disappointing sandwich, while below you, water is travelling through stone in the dark, following paths older than any map on your phone. If you find this kind of quiet exploration soothing, or if these long, careful stories help you wind down at the end of the day, I would be very grateful if you gave the video a like and subscribed. It helps this calm little corner reach others who might want something thoughtful to listen to before sleep. And if you are already settled in, with a cup of tea nearby, or perhaps one of those glasses of water placed by the bed with great confidence, and then entirely forgotten until morning, then you are in the right place. Tonight, we will not rush. Caves cannot be rushed anyway. Anyone who has ever read about caving, or tried squeezing through a gap while wearing too much equipment, will know that the underground world has no interest in human impatience. It does not care about schedules. It does not care if you would prefer a wider passage, a drier crawl, or a convenient little sign that says, "Exit this way, and mind your head." A cave is what it is. It was shaped by water, pressure, time, and geology. People may enter it, study it, survey it, and name its passages, but they do not command it. Mossdale sits in the Yorkshire Dales, a region known for its limestone scenery, open fells, dry stone walls, underground streams, and caves that attract people who are drawn to the places most of us never see. On the surface, the landscape can appear calm. There are slopes of grass, rough tracks, sheep doing whatever sheep consider important, and weather that may look harmless one moment and very busy the next. The Dales have a way of changing quickly. A patch of blue sky can become cloud. A light shower can become heavy rain. A beck, which is the northern word for a small stream, can rise faster than a visitor expects. This is important to remember because the Mossdale story is not just about what happened underground. It is also about what happened above ground, on the moor, in the sky, and in the water catchment feeding the cave. A cave flood does not begin where the caver first sees it. It begins somewhere else, often out of sight, where rain falls on slopes, gathers in channels, finds cracks in rock, and moves toward the lowest available route. In limestone country, that route may be a cave. The entrance to Mossdale Caverns is not the kind of grand opening that looks designed for postcards. It is not a show cave with railings, lights, a gift shop, and a small child asking whether there will be dragons. Mossdale is a serious cave system. It has long crawls, wet passages, difficult routes, and a known flood risk. Even experienced cavers treated it with respect. That word, respect, matters here. It is easy from the comfort of a chair to say that people should never enter dangerous places, but that would be too simple and not very fair. Cavers are not simply people who like being uncomfortable underground. Although it must be said, from the outside the sport does occasionally look like a determined effort to become cold, muddy, and wedged in a place where a human being was never politely invited. But caving is also exploration. It is science. It is mapping. It is teamwork. It is endurance. It is the patient study of water, rock, passage, and possibility. For many cavers, the attraction is not recklessness. It is the chance to understand a hidden part of the earth by moving through it carefully, one crawl, climb, squeeze, and streamway at a time. In the 1960s, caving in Britain was changing, equipment was improving. Clubs were active. Young people with skill, energy, and nerve were pushing farther into difficult systems. Many of them made or adapted their own gear. They learned from one another. They shared surveys, routes, warnings, and discoveries. It was a world built around trust, because underground, trust is not just a nice quality. It is part of survival. You trust the person ahead of you to pass back information. You trust the person behind you to keep moving. You trust the team to know when to continue and when to turn around. You trust the weather forecast, but not too much. You trust your lamp, your line, your memory, your judgment, and sometimes, quite literally, the grip of your boots on wet rock. In this world, Mossdale was known as a demanding system. It was not a casual trip. It was not somewhere to wander into because the afternoon looked free and the pub did not open for another hour. Mossdale required experience, fitness, and a willingness to endure long, awkward sections that would make most people reconsider their hobbies and possibly take up stamp collecting. On the 24th of June, 1967, a group of 10 cavers entered Mossdale. They were not tourists. They were not careless beginners. They belonged to a community of capable underground explorers, people who knew what a hard cave meant. 4 of them would later leave the system safely after a shorter trip. 6 continued deeper inside. Their names were Bill Frakes, Colin Vickers, Dave Adamson, Jeff Buiro, Michael Ryan, and John Ogden. It is important to say their names calmly and clearly, because a tragedy can become a single phrase over time. It can become the Mossdale disaster, the worst caving accident, or the 1967 tragedy. And while those phrases are accurate, they can also make the people at the centre of the story feel far away. These were young men with friends, families, plans, habits, jokes, and the normal small details that make up a life. One was only 17, the oldest was 26. That is an age range where the future still feels wide open, even if the map of it has not yet been drawn. They went into the cave as cavers often do, focused on the route, the work, and the task ahead. They could not know how quickly the conditions outside would turn against them. Weather is one of those everyday forces that can seem almost too ordinary to fear. We complain about it, we plan around it, we check it, misread it, ignore it, and then act personally offended when it does exactly what it was likely to do all along. In the Dales, rain is not just rain when a cave is involved. Rain is weight. Rain is flow. Rain is the rising of water through channels that may be narrow, steep, and already full. A storm over a cave catchment can send water through the underground system with frightening speed. And when the entrance of a cave takes a stream, or sits where floodwater can force its way in, the cave can change from a route into a trap. That is one of the hard truths at the centre of Mossdale. The same water that made the cave also made it dangerous. Limestone caves are records of water movement. Every passage has a history of flow, every scalloped wall, every worn bedding plane, every streamway and crawl tells you that water has been there before and may come again. A dry or passable route is not a promise. It is only a condition at that moment. The terrible part of the Mossdale story is how the world above and the world below became separated. Above, the weather worsened. Rain fell heavily. Mossdale Beck rose. The water found the cave entrance and began to flood the system. Below, the 6 men were somewhere deep inside, beyond passages that were already difficult in normal conditions. This is where caving danger becomes especially hard to imagine for anyone who has not experienced it. In many outdoor emergencies, there is at least open air. A mountain storm may be brutal, but the sky is still above you. A sea rescue may be desperate, but the horizon is visible. In a cave flood, the danger comes through the route itself. The way out fills, crawls become sumps, low airspace disappears, the sound changes, the current strengthens. A passage that had been unpleasant but passable becomes impossible. There is no dramatic villain in this kind of story, no machinery failure that can be pointed at neatly, no single broken bridge. There is rain, geology, timing, and human beings caught inside a system that had become stronger than them. One of the surviving members of the wider party, Morag Forbes, played a crucial role in raising the alarm. After the shorter trip, she understood that something was wrong when the entrance was submerged and she went for help across the moor. That detail deserves care, because it shows the beginning of the rescue not as a neat official sequence, but as a human response. Someone saw danger, understood its meaning, and acted. Rescue in places like Mossdale depends on that first recognition. It depends on a person being willing to move quickly, to cross rough ground, to get word out, and to bring others into action. In modern life, we're used to instant messages, location pins, emergency calls from almost anywhere, and the comforting illusion that help is always just a few taps away. In 1967, on a remote moor, in bad weather, with a cave entrance flooding, the chain of a rescue began in a much more physical way. It began with movement, urgency, and the knowledge that every passing minute mattered. The rescue that followed became one of the largest ever mounted in Britain. Hundreds of people were involved. Members of cave rescue teams, fell rescue volunteers, local people, cavers, officials, and many others worked in difficult conditions, trying to divert water, lower the flood level, and make entry possible. Imagine that scene for a moment, but not as a film with swelling music. Imagine it plainly. Wet clothing, mud, tools, headlamps, tired faces, people trying to make practical decisions while knowing that 6 men were somewhere beyond the water. The task was not only emotional, it was technical. The water had to be controlled, access had to be gained, the cave had to be entered without creating more casualties. Rescue work underground is not like running down a corridor and carrying someone out. In a system like Mossdale, rescuers must deal with narrow crawls, cold water, exhaustion, communication problems, and the constant possibility that conditions may worsen again. Courage in that setting is not loud. It is careful. It checks the rope. It watches the water. It listens to people who know the cave. It accepts that wanting to help is not enough if the cave will not allow it. Mossdale became a turning point because it forced the caving world to look closely at flood risk, rescue coordination, access decisions, weather judgment, and the limits of even the strongest teams. Before Mossdale, British caving already had rescue groups, skilled clubs, and experienced people who understood danger. The sport was not ignorant of risk, but some events become so severe that they change the seriousness with which risks are discussed. They become reference points. A name is enough. Mossdale became one of those names. It reminded cavers that a familiar system could still become deadly. It showed that experience did not make a person immune to weather, water, or bad timing. It raised questions that would influence future practice. How should flood-prone caves be assessed before entry? How should weather forecasts be treated? How should parties communicate their plans? How should rescue teams coordinate when an incident is large, remote, and technically difficult? How should the caving community remember those who died without turning their deaths into simple warnings or exaggerated legends? That last part matters. A tragedy can be mishandled in two opposite ways. It can be made too dramatic, stripped of facts, and turned into a frightening campfire story. Or it can be made too technical, reduced to times, passages, water levels, and procedures until the people vanish behind the details. Mossdale asks for something better than either of those. It asks for accuracy, but also care. It asks us to understand the cave as a physical place, the weather as a real force, the rescue as an enormous effort, and the 6 men as individuals. It also asks us to understand why people enter caves at all. Because without that, the story becomes too easy to judge from a safe distance. Cavers enter because the underground world is one of the few remaining places where exploration can still feel direct and personal. A person can move through a passage and help complete a map. They can follow a stream and answer a question about where water goes. They can crawl into a space no one has recorded before. That does not remove the danger, but it explains the draw. Curiosity has always taken human beings into difficult places. Mountains, polar ice, deserts, oceans, and caves all have their own kind of risk. The difference with caves is that the risk is hidden inside the earth, quiet until it is not. Tonight, we will move through this story in a careful order. We will first get to know the place itself, because Mossdale cannot be understood only by looking at the date of the accident. We need to understand the landscape above it, the limestone beneath it, the water that shaped it, and the reason cavers believed there was something important to find there. We will look at what Mossdale was like as a cave system, why it attracted serious explorers, and why its passages demanded so much from the people who entered. We will then come to the group who went underground on that June day, not as names on a plaque only, but as young cavers in a specific time with a specific purpose. We will follow the change in weather above them and the practical reality of what flooding meant below. We will move through the rescue effort with respect for those who tried to help, and we will look at what happened afterward, including the decisions that were made, the memorials that remain, and the safety lessons that entered caving culture after Mossdale. There is no need to rush into the darkest part of the story. In fact, rushing would make it harder to understand. Caves are slow places until suddenly they are not. Water shapes them over long periods, then can fill them in minutes. A caver may spend hours moving steadily inward, only for the route back to change faster than the mind can accept. That contrast is one reason Mossdale remains so important. It shows the gap between human planning and natural force. We make lists, check gear, agree routes, note times, and tell ourselves we've done what sensible people do. Often, that is enough. Many caving trips end with tired bodies, muddy faces, and the simple pleasure of reaching daylight again. But some places require an extra level of humility. Mossdale was one of them. It still is. The cave did not become famous because it was easy, and it did not become remembered because the risks were imaginary. It became remembered because 6 capable young men entered it, and a storm turned the conditions beyond recovery. So, for now, picture the Dales not as a tourist postcard, but as a working landscape of stone, grass, water, and weather. Picture the moor above Mossdale open to the sky. Picture the beck moving toward the scar. Picture the cave entrance at the base of the limestone taking water into the dark, and then picture the separate world below, where cavers in helmets and lamps moved through passages that required effort, patience, and trust. The surface and the underground were connected by water, but separated by knowledge. Those above could see the storm. Those below could only meet its consequences. That is where the story begins to tighten, not with noise or drama, but with the plain facts of landscape and timing. To understand how Mossdale changed caving forever, we first need to understand the cave itself, the place that waited under Yorkshire, and the long, difficult attraction it held for the people who wanted to know where its passages led. To understand Mossdale, we should begin above it, not inside it. That may seem strange for a story about a cave, but caves do not begin at their entrances. They begin in landscapes. They begin with rain on high ground, with streams crossing limestone, with water finding weakness in rock, with years becoming centuries, and centuries becoming passages large enough for a person to enter. Mossdale Caverns sit beneath the Yorkshire Dales, on the southern slopes of Great Whernside near Coniston in Wharfdale. On a clear day, the land can look broad and open, with rough grass, stone, sheep tracks, and the kind of sky that makes distances look simple. But that surface calm can be misleading. The ground there is not just ground, it is a roof. Under that roof is one of the most demanding cave systems in Britain. Mossdale is not a show cave. It is not a place of easy walkways, handrails, soft lights, and signs that remind you not to touch the stalactites. It is not somewhere a guide cheerfully says, "Mind your head," while everyone takes pictures and wonders whether the gift shop sells fudge. Mossdale belongs to a different world altogether. It is long, wet, difficult, and serious. It contains miles of passages, crawls, streamways, tight sections, and routes that require commitment from anyone who enters. A trip to the far end and back has been described as taking 8 to 10 hours, which is quite a long time to spend underground, especially when much of that time is not spent strolling majestically through cathedral-like chambers, but crawling, stooping, squeezing, climbing, wading, and trying to persuade cold water not to become a permanent feature of your clothing. The cave lies where Mossdale Beck sinks at the base of Mossdale Scar. That word beck is worth holding on to because it matters. A beck can sound harmless if you do not live in northern England. It sounds almost friendly, like something that might burble past a picnic blanket or provide background noise for a sheep with a lot on its mind. But in cave country, a beck is not only scenery, it is a route for water. It is part of a system. When Mossdale Beck meets the limestone, it does not simply continue politely across the surface. It disappears into the ground. It enters the cave. The same water that gives Mossdale its character also gives it its danger. That is the plain fact that sits beneath everything else in this story. Limestone is a rock that water can slowly dissolve. Rainwater absorbs carbon dioxide from the air and soil, becoming mildly acidic. Not dramatic acid, not the sort that hisses through a laboratory bench in a film, but enough, over a long time, to widen cracks and joints in the stone. Water finds a weakness, trickles through it, enlarges it, returns to it, enlarges it again, and keeps going. Eventually, a crack becomes a slot becomes a passage becomes part of a cave system. The process is slow enough that a person cannot watch it happen in a single afternoon, unless they have a very unusual definition of entertainment and possibly a chair built for geological patience. But the result is real. The dales are full of this hidden drainage. Streams vanish underground, travel through passages, and emerge somewhere else as springs. Above, the land may look quiet. Below, water is busy. Mossdale's water has been traced toward Black Keld, several kilometres away and much lower in Wharfdale. That kind of underground connection has always fascinated cavers and cave researchers. If water can pass through, perhaps people can find a way through as well. That thought can pull at the mind. It turns a hillside into a question. It turns a stream sink into the beginning of a map. In the decades before the tragedy, Mossdale was not only a known cave, it was a problem to be solved. Where did the water go? How far did the passages extend? Could there be a larger system beyond the explored routes? Was Mossdale a key to one of the great hidden drainage puzzles of the Dales? To people who loved caves, these were not casual questions. They were the kind that could occupy years. Long before 1967, Mossdale had already earned a reputation. Its discovery and exploration were linked with some of the strongest names in British caving. Eli Simpson, one of the major figures in Yorkshire cave exploration, believed there was a large undiscovered system in the area. Bob Leakey, another well-known caver, became closely associated with Mossdale after the entrance was found in 1941. The story often told is that Leakey discovered the way in while looking for a dropped tobacco pipe. This is one of those details that history occasionally hands us with a straight face, as if to remind us that major discoveries do not always begin with trumpets. Sometimes they begin with someone searching the ground for a lost pipe and accidentally finding a way into a cave system that will become famous, feared, studied, and remembered for generations. It is a very human beginning, not grand, not tidy. Just a person, a hillside, a small lost object, and a much larger opening into the earth. During the Second World War years, exploration continued in ways that now feel both impressive and slightly astonishing. There were shortages of available men because of the war, and Leakey recruited women from a Yadon aircraft factory to help with early exploration. That detail says something important about caving culture at the time. It was practical. It used whoever had strength, willingness, and nerve. The cave did not care about anyone's assumptions. It required people who could endure it. Early Mossdale exploration demanded long crawls, wet conditions, awkward passages, and a tolerance for discomfort that most of us prefer to reserve for assembling flat-pack furniture. Yet the teams went in because there was more to learn, and because the cave kept offering just enough passage to pull them farther. Mossdale was not generous. Some caves reward explorers with large chambers, dramatic formations, or open walking passage where the lamp beam can stretch ahead and make the whole effort feel noble. Mossdale often asked for something less glamorous. It asked people to crawl. It asked them to get wet. It asked them to keep moving through passages that could be low, constricted, and physically draining. A cave like that changes the meaning of distance. On the surface, 100 meters is a brief walk. Underground, through cold water, over uneven rock, under low ceilings with gear catching and knees complaining, 100 meters can become a small personal negotiation. The body becomes very aware of itself. Elbows, boots, helmet, lamp, breath, and balance all become part of the journey. A caver cannot drift through Mossdale absent-mindedly. The cave demands attention. This is one reason it became such a respected and intimidating system. It was not only long, it was tiring. It tested stamina as much as curiosity. A person entering Mossdale had to be prepared for the return as well as the inward journey. That sounds obvious, but it is one of the quiet rules of caving that matters deeply. In many places, the hardest part is not reaching the far point. It is coming back after cold, effort and time have taken their share. The cave does not shorten itself because you are tired. The crawls do not widen out of sympathy. The stream does not decide to be warmer because you have had a difficult day. Everything you passed on the way in must usually be passed again on the way out. That is why judgment is so important underground. Continuing forward is always a decision made against the knowledge that retreat will take energy too. Mossdale's entrance made that judgment even more serious because of the water. In dry or ordinary conditions, the cave might be difficult but passable for a skilled team. In flood conditions, the same passages could become deadly. The entrance series was particularly vulnerable because Mossdale Beck could rise and force water into the cave. If the entrance flooded, anyone inside could be cut off. This is not a small inconvenience, like finding the front door stuck and having to use the back. In caving, a flooded passage can mean the only route out has vanished. Low sections may fill to the roof. Crawls may become sumps, which are fully flooded passages. Airspace can disappear. A place that had been unpleasant but possible can become impassable with terrifying speed. Flood risk is not always easy to judge from within a cave. Underground, a caver may not know what is happening across the moor above. Rain may be falling miles away. A thunderstorm may sit over a catchment while the cave team hears only the normal sound of water. In some caves, rising water announces itself with changes in noise or flow. In others, the warning may come too late. The surface world and the underground world do not share information politely. There is no bell that rings when a beck outside has risen beyond a safe level. There is only knowledge, planning, forecast, experience and caution, and even those can be tested by weather that changes quickly. The Yorkshire Dales are beautiful, but they are not soft. Weather can move across the high ground with little concern for human plans. Rain can gather on moorland and run down into becks. In limestone areas, that water may sink quickly into underground channels. When people look at a landscape like Mossdale on a calm day, it is easy to see grass and stone and assume slowness. But hydrology, the movement of water, can be fast. The catchment feeding a cave may collect rainfall over a wider area than the entrance suggests. A caver standing at the mouth of a system may see one stream, one opening, one patch of rock. The cave is responding to a much larger piece of land. That is part of the danger. Mossdale was not dangerous because it was mysterious in some theatrical way. It was dangerous because of specific practical conditions. It was long, it was wet, it was physically demanding, it had a flood-prone entrance, it contained sections where retreat could be slow, it sat beneath a landscape where water could enter the system quickly after heavy rain. These are not dramatic details, but they are the details that matter. Real danger often sounds plain when described accurately. A low crawl, a rising stream, a blocked exit, a tired team, bad weather. None of those needs decoration. By the 1960s, Mossdale had become a place for experienced cavers, not casual visitors. It had a reputation as one of the toughest systems in the country. Some accounts describe it with phrases like severe, super severe, or the Everest of British caving. Phrases like that should be treated carefully. They can make a cave sound like a prize to be conquered, and caves are not conquered. They are entered, explored, surveyed, respected, and left. Still, the comparison tells us how people viewed Mossdale. It was an ultimate challenge. It attracted those who wanted to push farther into hard underground territory. The far reaches were known to very few people. To get there required endurance and confidence, not confidence in the casual sense, where someone says they are sure everything will be fine because they have brought an extra sandwich. Real confidence in caving means skill, preparation, route knowledge, and the ability to keep making careful choices while wet, cold, and tired. Exploration also meant mapping. A cave is not understood simply by walking through it. Cavers survey passages, measure distances, note directions, record climbs, pools, crawls, junctions, and hazards. The result is a map, but it is a map earned the hard way. On the surface, a surveyor can stand upright, consult instruments, and maybe complain about drizzle. Underground, the same work can involve lying in water, holding a notebook above mud, trying to read instruments by lamplight, and discovering that the pencil has developed strong views about not working. Yet those surveys are essential. They turn experience into shared knowledge. They allow future teams to plan. They help rescue teams understand where people may be. They contribute to the science of the system. Mossdale's map was built through effort of that kind. The cave also held the promise of a larger connection. The idea of a hidden route toward the Black Keld resurgence gave Mossdale an importance beyond its known passages. It suggested that somewhere beyond the difficult crawls and streamways, there might be more cave, perhaps much more. This possibility mattered to the caving community. Exploration often depends on such possibilities. A narrow route may be endured because it might open. A wet crawl may be pushed because the draft, the water flow, or the geology suggests continuation. The reward is not always comfort. Often, the reward is simply knowing what is there. For people outside caving, this can be hard to understand. Why crawl into a cold, narrow, wet space for hours just to find out whether it continues? Why spend a weekend underground when the surface offers daylight, fresh air and cafes with chairs? The answer is partly curiosity, partly challenge, partly companionship, and partly the special satisfaction of going somewhere that is not arranged for human convenience. Modern life gives us many experiences that have been cleaned, packaged, signposted and made safe. Caving is not like that. It asks for direct contact with the place. You do not watch it through a screen. You do not stand at a viewpoint. You enter. You move through the rock. You become aware of water, temperature, mud, distance, and the small circle of light in front of you. For some people, that is not unpleasant. It is exactly the point. Still, love of caving does not remove the need for caution. If anything, serious cavers tend to understand danger more deeply than outsiders do. They know that a cave can be familiar and still hazardous. They know that experience reduces risk but does not erase it. Mossdale's reputation would have been known to those who approached it. Its flooding risk was not a secret. Its difficulty was not hidden. That makes the later tragedy more painful, because it was not a simple case of people wandering blindly into an unknown danger. It was a known hard cave entered by capable people in a sport where conditions, judgment and timing can sometimes meet in the worst possible way. There is also a certain stillness around a cave entrance that can make risk feel distant. The entrance may look like a hole in rock with water moving through it. The moor may look ordinary. Gear may be sorted. Lamps may be checked. Someone may make a joke. Someone may adjust a belt, pull on a helmet, or complain about the cold before even getting properly wet, which is one of the traditional privileges of outdoor activity. The day begins as days do, with small practical actions. A dangerous place does not always announce itself with a warning that matches what may come. Mossdale did not have to look dramatic to be serious. It only had to be connected to water. As we stay for a while with the cave itself, before the people and the weather and the rescue come fully into view, it helps to remember that Mossdale was shaped by forces without intention. The cave did not wait in a human sense. It did not choose. It did not trap out of malice. It was a limestone system carrying water through the hillside. But for cavers, places do gather meaning. A passage becomes known by its difficulty. A crawl becomes remembered by the people who pushed it. A junction becomes part of a route. A chamber becomes a landmark. Over years, the cave becomes not only geology but shared experience. Mossdale had become a name with weight long before 1967. After 1967, that weight changed completely. Before the tragedy, Mossdale represented challenge and possibility. It was a hard system with unanswered questions. It offered the chance to understand hidden drainage beneath the dales. It drew strong carvers because it was difficult, not despite that difficulty. It stood at the edge of what ordinary club exploration could demand from people. It was cold, wet, long, and complicated. It was a place where skill mattered, where endurance mattered, and where respect for weather should never be relaxed. The cave was not waiting like a villain in a story. It was waiting like a hard fact waits, unchanged by whether people are ready for it. By the time the group entered on that June day in 1967, Mossdale already had a history of exploration, reputation and warning. It had been entered, surveyed, discussed, admired and feared. It had given cavers long days underground and reasons to return. It had also shown, again and again, that water controlled the terms. That is the essential point to carry forward. Mossdale was a cave made by water, entered through water, threatened by water, and remembered because of water. The landscape above it and the passages below it were connected more closely than anyone on the surface might guess at first glance. Grass, scar, beck, entrance, crawl, streamway and far passage were all parts of one system, and once that is understood, the next part of the story becomes clearer. The men who entered Mossdale were not stepping into a blank darkness. They were entering a known challenge beneath a known landscape. drawn by the same mixture of curiosity, purpose and determination that had brought explorers there since the 1940s. To understand their journey, we need to keep Mossdale as a real place in the mind. Not a legend, not only a tragedy. A cave under Yorkshire fed by a beck carved in limestone, difficult in ordinary conditions, unforgiving in flood, and powerful enough to change the way a whole community thought about safety underground. The cave under Mossdale did not appear suddenly. It was not made in one violent break, or opened by a single collapse, or carved in a way that a human mind can comfortably picture from start to finish. It was made slowly, by water doing what water does best, finding a way through. That sounds simple, almost too simple, but in limestone country, simple things repeated for long enough can build entire hidden worlds. A drop of rain falls on the high ground. It gathers with other drops. It runs downhill into a small channel. It joins a beck. It reaches cracked limestone. Then, instead of staying on the surface where we can follow it with our eyes, it slips into the rock and begins working in the dark. Limestone is strong enough to build walls, scars, pavements and cliffs, but it has a weakness. Rainwater, after passing through air and soil, becomes slightly acidic. Not enough to be dramatic. Not enough to melt your boots, thankfully, or make a hillside behave like a badly supervised science experiment, but enough to dissolve tiny amounts of limestone over time. The water enters cracks, bedding planes, joints and faults. It widens them by small degrees. It returns again with the next rain, then again and again through seasons, years and centuries. At first, there may be only a hairline route through the rock. Later, there is a crack large enough for more water. Later still, there is a passage. Then a streamway. Then a cave system that seems, to anyone entering it, as if it has always been there. This is one of the quiet facts that makes caves so difficult to fully hold in the mind. They are both solid and temporary. The rock feels permanent when you put your hand on it. The walls are hard, the ceiling is hard, the floor does not seem to care about your knees, and yet the whole place is evidence of change. A cave is not empty space by accident. It is rock that has been removed, grain by grain, solution by solution, flood by flood. Mossdale is not a hollow under Yorkshire in the way a room is hollow inside a house. It is a drainage route, a record of water moving through layers of stone. To enter it is not simply to enter a hole. It is to step into the plumbing of a landscape. Above Mossdale, the land may seem open and uncomplicated. There is grass, moor, scar and sky. The shapes are visible. You can point to a slope, a stream, a wall, a patch of limestone, and feel you understand the basic arrangement of things. But the underground system is less straightforward. Water that disappears in one place may travel far from where anyone expects it to go. It may pass through winding routes, narrow bedding planes, deep sections, flooded passages and unseen channels. Mossdale Beck sinks at the foot of Mossdale Scar, and the water does not politely return to daylight just around the corner. It travels underground toward Blackheld near the River Wharfe, several kilometres away. Between those points lies the great question that has pulled cavers toward the area for decades. Where exactly does the water go? That question may sound modest if you are thinking in surface terms. On the surface, a stream can be followed. You walk beside it, cross it, get one boot wetter than expected, perhaps mutter something unkind about your socks, and continue. Underground, the same stream becomes harder to know. It vanishes into rock. It may split. It may enter sections too tight for people. It may pass through flooded routes where only cave divers could hope to continue, and even then only under conditions that demand enormous skill. The water does not need a passage suitable for a human body. It only needs a route suitable for water. That difference is very important. A stream can squeeze through cracks, bedding planes, gravel chokes, and flooded tubes that no caver can pass. The cave system, people know, is only the part the human body can enter. The water may know much more. This is why the missing route between Mossdale and Blackkeld has mattered so much. It suggests a large hidden connection, a system partly known, partly guessed, partly proven by dye testing and water flow, but not fully entered. For cavers, that kind of place has a special pull. It is not only adventure, it is a puzzle with mud on it. It is science conducted with helmets, lamps, surveys and cold hands. If water travels underground from here to there, then somewhere in the darkness there must be passages, fractures, flooded routes, or channels that allow it. Finding them is another matter entirely. The cave gives no guarantee that the route will be passable. It gives only hints. The word labyrinth is often used for caves, and in Mossdale's case it is not a bad word, as long as we do not imagine something neat and designed. A human labyrinth has a plan. Someone built it. Someone decided where the turns should go. Mossdale's passages were not designed. They developed where water could move through weakness in the rock. That makes the system irregular. Some sections may follow bedding planes where layers of rock meet. Some may follow joints or fractures. Some may be widened by stronger flow. Some may be left behind as older routes while the water finds a lower or easier path. The result is not a tidy underground corridor. It is a network shaped by pressure, drainage, erosion, collapse and time. For a caver inside such a system, every passage has practical meaning. A low crawl is not just a line on a survey, it is a place where the body must go flat. A streamway is not just an interesting feature, it is cold water around the legs, sometimes higher. A bedding plane is not just a geological term, it can be a roof just above the helmet, a floor under the chest, and a long stretch of movement where elbows and knees do most of the work. A junction is not just a point where passages meet, it is a decision. Left, right, continue, turn around. In easy caves, mistakes can sometimes be corrected with mild embarrassment and a bit of backtracking. In Mossdale, distance, cold, fatigue, and water make every decision heavier. Mossdale's difficulty is partly physical and partly psychological. Long wet crawls drain energy in a slow, stubborn way. Cold water takes warmth from the body. Narrow passages increase the sense of effort because movement must be deliberate. There is no casual stride, no relaxed swinging of arms, no easy pause where you can stand upright and look around like a person admiring a museum exhibit. You crawl, stop, shuffle, pull, push and continue. Gear catches, boots scrape, lamps reflect off wet rock. The world becomes the size of the passage and the small pool of light ahead. A person who has never been in a difficult cave may imagine fear as the main challenge. Sometimes it is, but often the challenge is endurance. It is staying patient when progress is slow. It is keeping track of time when the cave offers no daylight. It is accepting that comfort has gone elsewhere for the day and has not left a forwarding address. Water changes all of this. In ordinary conditions, water may be an obstacle, a discomfort, a constant presence. In flood, it becomes the controlling force. This is why Mossdale was so dangerous. The entrance takes Mossdale Beck, and in heavy rain the water level can rise fast enough to fill parts of the entrance series. Passages that are only minutes from daylight can fill to the roof. Farther inside, a small rise in water level can cause other sections to sump. That word, sump, is short and plain, but it carries a lot of meaning underground. A sump is a flooded passage. If you're not equipped, trained and prepared for cave diving, it is not a passage anymore. It is a wall made of water. A cave flood is not like a puddle becoming inconveniently deep. It can transform the shape of the route. A crawl with airspace becomes a submerged tube. A streamway with a clear bank becomes a fast channel. A low arch that required a duck of the head becomes impassable. Water can carry foam, silt, stones and debris. It can reduce visibility. It can make sound confusing. It can chill the body quickly. It can push against a person in awkward places where there is no room to brace properly. Above all, it can remove the way out. That is the most frightening practical fact. Underground, the entrance is not merely an opening, it is the route back to air, daylight, and help. If water takes that route, the cave has changed the rules. The danger is made worse by timing. A team deep inside Mossdale might have entered in acceptable conditions, with the beck low enough and the sky not yet alarming. But weather can change while they are underground. The storm that matters may not even be directly overhead at first. Rain can fall across the catchment feeding the cave, collect in the beck, and then arrive at the entrance as rising water. Underground, the team may not know what has happened. They may hear water, but caves already have water. They may notice increased flow, but by the time the change is obvious, the most vulnerable parts of the route may already be affected. The surface has weather. The cave has consequences. It is easy to say from a safe distance that the solution is simply not to enter caves when rain is possible. And in many flood-prone systems, that is exactly the rule careful cavers follow. But the full picture is more complicated because weather forecasts, local storms, catchment behaviour, and cave response can all vary. In the years before modern forecasting and instant information, judgment depended heavily on experience, observation, and local knowledge. Even today, with better forecasts and communication, flood-prone caves demand caution. Mossdale is the kind of system where the warning has to be taken seriously before the trip begins, because once the flood has arrived, decisions become narrow. In some places there may be higher refuges, in others, none. In some systems, water rises slowly. In Mossdale, critical sections can become impassable quickly. The shape of the cave matters here. If a cave has large high-level passages, a flood may be frightening but survivable in certain areas. If a cave has low crawls, constrictions and stream-fed sections, flooding can be far more dangerous. Mossdale includes many passages where crawling is necessary, and some sections can already be wet or deep in normal conditions. When water rises in such a cave, there is little spare space. The difference between a passable crawl and a blocked crawl may be only a modest increase in water level. The cave does not need to fill everywhere at once to become deadly. It only needs to block the wrong sections. Think of a house with many rooms but one narrow hallway leading to the front door. If that hallway becomes blocked, it does not matter that the rooms still have air. The way out is gone. In a cave, the equivalent can happen with water. There may be dry or partly dry sections beyond the flood, but if the route back passes through a sump, the team is trapped. Rescue then depends on lowering the water, diverting the stream, waiting for levels to drop, or, in some cases, sending in divers. Each option takes time. In cold underground conditions, time is not a neutral thing. It affects body temperature, strength, decision-making, and hope. Mossdale's limestone also adds to the complexity because the system is not just a single neat tunnel. It contains a network of passages formed through layered rock. Water can move through different routes depending on level and pressure. During flood, passages that are normally minor may take more flow. Sections that are normally air-filled may back up. A cave is not a simple pipe, even if we sometimes explain it that way. It is closer to a complicated set of natural drains. Some open, some narrow, some blocked, some connected in ways that are not obvious. The water does not read the survey, it follows physics. This is one reason surveying and geological understanding were so important to Mossdale. The cave was not only a place to visit, it was a system to understand. Cavers wanted to know how the passages related to the surface, how the stream sank, how the water travelled, and where the missing connection might lie. Such work can involve dye tracing, where a harmless dye is placed into sinking water and later detected at a resurgence. It can involve mapping passage directions, comparing elevations, observing flood response, and looking for drafts or continuation. In a place like Mossdale, geology, hydrology, and exploration are tied together. You cannot understand the cave without understanding the water, and you cannot understand the danger without understanding both. There is a strange contrast in this. The same features that made Mossdale scientifically and exploratively interesting also made it hazardous. The sinking beck, the long underground drainage route, the hidden connection toward Black Keld, the wet crawls, the streamways, the flood-prone entrance. All of these belonged to one system. The cave attracted people because it was part of a major underground water story. It endangered people because that water story was active, forceful, and sometimes fast. Curiosity and risk were not separate paths. They followed the same stream. The making of Mossdale was not finished in 1967, and it is not finished now. Caves continue to change. Floods move sediment. Rockfalls happen. Passages become blocked or opened. Water shifts routes. Human knowledge improves, but the cave remains a working natural system. That is a humbling thing. A survey is a record, not a command. A name on a passage is a convenience, not ownership. A difficult cave does not become safe because it has been entered many times. Familiarity can help, but it can also soften caution if people are not careful. Mossdale is a reminder that in caves, the old forces are still present. Water is not history, it is current. When cavers speak of flood risk, they are speaking from this practical understanding. They are thinking not only of rainfall, but of catchment, passage shape, water level, airspace, sump formation, and the speed of response. They are thinking about whether a team can retreat if conditions change. They are thinking about how long a trip will take, and whether the forecast covers the entire period underground. They are thinking about the most constricted sections, not the easiest ones. A cave is judged by its limiting points. The safest looking chamber is not much comfort if the crawl before it can flood to the roof. This is why Mossdale became such a severe lesson. It was not a random place where danger appeared from nowhere. Its danger was built into the relationship between the surface and the cave. Rain fell above. Mossdale Beck rose. Water entered the system. The entrance and passages responded. That is the chain. Simple to describe, terrible in consequence. The cave had been made by water, and on the day of the tragedy, water reclaimed the routes people needed. Still, it is important not to turn Mossdale into a place of pure menace. That would be inaccurate. Caves are not moral things. Mossdale is a remarkable natural system, part of the geology and drainage of the Yorkshire Dales. It has value as a cave, as a hydrological system, as a piece of natural history, and as a site of deep memory for the caving community. To call it only dangerous would be like calling the sea only wet. True, but not enough. Mossdale was dangerous because it was alive with water in the geological sense, because it carried the drainage of a real landscape, because its passages were shaped by forces larger than human plans. It was also fascinating for the same reasons. In slow terms, Mossdale was made by patience. In sudden terms, it could become lethal through speed. That is the contradiction at the heart of many limestone caves. They are created over immense spans of time, but their hazards can arrive in minutes. The walls may be ancient, but the flood is immediate. The passage may have taken thousands of years to form, but the airspace can vanish during one storm. A person can admire the geology and still be trapped by the weather. Both things are true. As the story moves closer to the people who entered Mossdale, keep this physical picture in mind. The cave was not just dark. It was wet, long, low, and connected to a beck that could rise. The passages did not exist separately from the moor above. The underground route and the surface weather were part of one working system. A storm did not have to enter the cave as thunder and lightning. It entered as water. It entered through the same route that had built Mossdale in the first place. And for the cavers who went inside, that meant the landscape above them was never really above them at all. It was connected to every crawl, every streamway, every tight place, and every decision made in the dark. By the afternoon of Saturday, the 24th of June, 1967, the cave had become more than a place on a map. It had become the plan for the day. 10 cavers made their way to Mossdale Caverns, carrying equipment, knowledge, and the kind of confidence that comes from experience rather than carelessness. They were young, but they were not simply wandering into the hillside on a whim. They belonged to a world of clubs, shared routes, borrowed knowledge, handwritten surveys, wet ropes, battered helmets, and conversations that probably made perfect sense to cavers and sounded mildly alarming to everyone else. In ordinary company, saying that you plan to spend your Saturday crawling through cold limestone passages for hours might earn a pause, a raised eyebrow, and possibly a polite suggestion to try gardening. Among cavers, it could sound like a serious and worthwhile trip. The 6 names at the centre of this story were Dave Adamson, Jeff Boyrow, Bill Frakes, John Ogden, Michael Ryan, and Colin Vickers. Dave Adamson was 26, Jeff Boyrow was 24, Colin Vickers was 23, John Ogden was 20. Bill Frakes was 19, Michael Ryan was 17. These ages matter because they remind us that this was not some distant group of figures from a faded report. They were young men. Some were only just beginning adult life. Some were students. Some were members of the active caving community around Leeds, Bradford, and the wider Yorkshire area. They were at an age where a person can be skilled, determined, and still very close to the beginning of everything. A difficult cave trip could feel like part of a larger life of exploration, study, friendship, and weekend plans. It was not supposed to become the event by which their names would be remembered. It is worth saying again, with care, that these were not people who had mistaken a serious cave for a tourist attraction. Mossdale was not hidden behind a ticket booth. It was not a place where a person could wander in wearing ordinary shoes and a light jacket, then complain that the ground was a bit uneven. The cavers who entered that day knew that caves demanded preparation. They knew that underground travel was slow. They knew that Mossdale had a hard reputation. The system was already respected and in some circles feared. It required stamina, route knowledge, and the willingness to keep going through long wet crawls that would make most people decide they had suddenly developed a strong interest in staying above ground. Caving in the 1960s was different from caving now in many practical ways. Equipment existed, of course, and experienced cavers took gear seriously, but the sport had a stronger make-do character. Helmets, lamps, clothing, ropes, and bags were often simpler, heavier, less comfortable, or more improvised than modern equipment. A caver's kit might be repaired, adapted, shared, and argued over. Today, outdoor equipment can look like it was designed by a committee of engineers who also had a side interest in looking stylish in catalogues. In the 1960s, much of the equipment culture was more direct. If something worked, it worked. If it did not work, someone probably tried to improve it in a shed. Caving clubs were places where knowledge moved from person to person, and that knowledge mattered as much as anything bought from a shop. The caving clubs themselves were part of the story. British caving has long depended on clubs, not only for companionship but for training, surveying, rescue, access, and memory. A club gives a caver people to learn from, people to trust, and people to argue with about the best way through a passage so tight that the cave itself seems to have strong opinions against visitors. A club also gives structure to exploration. Trips are planned, routes are discussed, new finds are recorded, mistakes are remembered, warnings are passed on. That culture of shared knowledge is one reason caving developed as it did in places like Yorkshire. The caves were too complex, too demanding, and too risky for knowledge to remain private. Underground, a useful warning is not gossip, it is safety. The party that went to Mossdale that day was connected with that club world. They were part of a wider culture of young carvers who wanted to push difficult systems, fill in gaps on surveys, and understand underground routes that still held unanswered questions. Mossdale was not simply a place to visit. It was a challenge tied to an unresolved problem. The water sinking into Mossdale was believed to connect eventually to Black Keld, and cavers had long hoped to understand that route. The missing connection was not just a curiosity, it was a major question in the drainage of the area. To a serious caver, that kind of question can be hard to ignore. If the land is hiding a route, someone will want to find it. This is where we have to understand the mindset without turning it into something reckless. Exploration often looks unreasonable from the outside. Why go farther into a cave that is cold, narrow, wet, and difficult? Why spend hours moving through passages that do not welcome the human body? Why take on discomfort when ordinary life already provides enough small annoyances like bills, early alarms, and that one drawer in the kitchen that never opens properly because it contains too many batteries? The answer is that exploration has never been driven by comfort. It is driven by purpose. In caving, that purpose may be mapping, discovery, science, skill, teamwork, or the satisfaction of entering a place that cannot be understood from the surface. For some people, a difficult cave is not a warning to stay away. It is an invitation to prepare properly. The young men who continued deeper into Mossdale would have known that the cave required effort. They would have expected wet crawls and slow progress. They would have known that a long trip underground takes both physical and mental steadiness. A caver must be able to keep moving when cold water gets into clothing, when knees begin to ache, when the helmet knocks the roof yet again, and when the passage seems to be making the same awkward joke for the 20th time. It is not glamorous in the usual sense. There are no heroic poses in a low crawl. Nobody looks especially noble while lying in mud, trying to move a tackle bag forward with one foot. But there is a kind of discipline in it. You keep going because the team is moving, because the route has been chosen, and because each small piece of progress matters. The full group of 10 did not all continue together to the far reaches. At a point in the trip, 4 turned back and left the cave while 6 carried on. This detail can sound simple when reduced to one sentence, but underground decisions are often shaped by practical matters. Energy, time, route objectives, comfort, conditions, and the purpose of the trip can all affect who continues and who exits. There is no need to make the split dramatic. In caving, groups can divide for reasonable reasons. Some may choose a shorter objective. Others may be better suited to the harder section. Some may have had enough for the day. And in a cave like Mossdale, turning back after a shorter trip was not failure. It was normal judgment. The tragedy was not caused by the simple fact that the party split. The danger came from what happened next, outside the cave and through the water. Among the 4 who left was Morag Forbes, whose later actions became crucial. After exiting, she returned to the entrance and found it submerged. That moment must have been clear in a way that allowed no comfort. A flooded entrance at Mossdale meant that the 6 still inside were in immediate danger. It did not mean someone was late. It did not mean a lamp had failed or a team had taken longer than expected. It meant that the way out was blocked by water and that the cave had changed while the men were underground. Morag went for help across the moor. That part of the story belongs more fully to the rescue effort, but it begins here, with the people who had entered together and the sudden realization that not everyone had come back into the same world they had left. Before the storm, before the alarm, before Mossdale became a national rescue story, the day would have had the ordinary details. Boots tightened, helmets adjusted, lamps checked. Perhaps someone made a comment about the weather, the walk to the entrance, or the usual discomfort of caving clothing. These small details are not recorded in full, and we should not pretend to know them. But every trip has them. Serious events often begin with ordinary preparation. That is part of what makes them hard to process later. Nothing at the start needs to look historic. A person does not wake up inside a tragedy. They wake up inside a day. They get dressed. They travel. They meet others. They talk. They begin. The 6 who went on deeper into Mossdale were doing something that made sense within their world. They were young cavers in a region where caving had a strong culture. They were entering a known hard system with a purpose. They would have moved by lamplight through the entrance series and into the passages beyond, leaving daylight behind in stages. At first, there is usually still a sense of the surface nearby. The entrance is behind you. The outside air may still be close. Then, after enough turns, crawls and stream noise, the surface becomes an idea rather than a visible place. Time changes underground. Not in the Einstein sense, although a long crawl can make anyone feel that time has taken up unusual hobbies. It changes because there are no clocks in the rock, no sun moving across the sky, no ordinary markers of afternoon becoming evening. There is only the route, the team, the effort, and the lamp beam. A caver's lamp is a small but important part of this experience. It does not illuminate the cave as a room. It creates a circle of workable reality. The rest remains dark until the cavern reaches it. That is one reason underground movement can feel so focused. You deal with what is directly ahead. A rock lip, a pool, a low section, a bend, a climb. You do not see the whole cave at once. You know it from movement and memory. Each person in the team may carry their own mental version of the route, built from survey knowledge, experience, and what they have just passed. In a place like Mossdale, that knowledge had to be active. The cave did not allow passive travel. The age of the men also connects to the wider culture of the time. Post-war Britain had seen outdoor clubs, university groups, and local societies become important places for young people with technical interests and physical energy. Caving sat somewhere between sport, science, and exploration. It had elements of all three. It required fitness, but also careful observation. It involved risk, but also method. It could be social, but it also demanded discipline. A group underground is only as strong as its ability to stay coordinated. In easy places, friendship can mean laughter and shared stories. In difficult caves, friendship can also mean waiting at a constriction, checking that the person behind has passed, helping move gear, and knowing when someone is tiring before they need to say it. That team element is easy to overlook if the story is told only as a disaster. The 6 men were not alone in the usual sense. They were together. They would have moved as caving parties move, not always shoulder to shoulder because the cave would not permit that, but connected by route, timing, and intention. In narrow passages, one person may be ahead and another behind, with voice contact limited by turns, water noise, and distance. In larger sections, the group may gather, rest, decide, and continue. The team is stretched and compressed by the shape of the cave. That is one of the difficult things about rescue and accident reconstruction underground. Human movement is shaped by geology. A passage decides where people can be close and where they must separate. The young cavers who entered Mossdale were also part of a period when the boundaries of the sport were being tested. Difficult caves were being pushed farther. New passages were being found. Surveys were being improved. There was ambition in the caving world, as there often is in any exploration community. Ambition can be valuable. Without it, maps remain incomplete, scientific understanding advances more slowly, and hard places stay unknown. But ambition has to live beside caution. That balance is not always simple. Every serious outdoor activity has this tension. Mountaineers know it. Sailors know it. Divers know it. Cavers know it especially well, because the underground environment gives very little room for error when water, cold, distance, and narrow passages combine. It would be unfair to look back and treat the 6 men as symbols of overconfidence. The known facts do not need that. They were experienced young cavers in a dangerous system on a day when the weather changed with terrible consequences. We can learn from what happened without making the people smaller. That matters because tragedy often invites easy judgment. From the safety of decades later, with modern safety culture, better communication, and the story already known, it can seem obvious that everything should have gone differently. But hindsight is a very comfortable armchair. It knows the ending before the day begins. The people inside the story did not have that luxury. The cavers entered Mossdale before the flood made the danger visible in its final form. They could not see the future water level at the entrance. They could not know exactly how quickly the beck would rise. They could not know that their names would become tied forever to the worst caving accident in Britain. They were moving through the day as people do, making decisions with the information available to them. That does not mean there were no lessons. There were many. But the lessons came at a terrible cost, and the cost was paid by real people, not by a diagram in a safety manual. As they continued deeper, the surface world was still close in a physical sense, but unreachable in experience. Above them were the moor, the sky, the beck, and the weather. Below, or rather within the hillside, they had the cave. The two worlds were linked by water, though the men could not see what the sky was preparing. This separation is one of the cruel features of cave flooding. The people most affected may be the last to know. A walker on the moor can see rain. A farmer can watch a stream rise. A person near the entrance can see water swallowing the way in. But deep underground, a team may be working through a passage with no clear sign of the storm above, until the cave itself begins to change. There is also the matter of sound. Caves can be noisy where water is running. A streamway may already echo and rush. Drips fall from ceilings. Boots splash. Voices bounce strangely from walls. In such a place, rising water may not announce itself with a single obvious signal. It may be noticed through flow, depth, foam, current, or changes in familiar sections. If a team is far from the entrance, those changes may come too late to make retreat possible. The cave's warning system is not designed for human needs. It is just the movement of water through rock. For the men inside, the trip would have continued in the practical rhythm of caving. Crawl, stop, move a bag, check the route, wait for the next person, continue. At times, perhaps talk. At other times, silence except for breathing, water, and the contact of body and gear against stone. The darkness would have been ordinary to them. That is another point worth understanding. Experienced cavers do not treat darkness as a surprise. It is the medium in which the trip happens. Their lamps made the route possible. Their knowledge made the darkness navigable. The danger was not darkness by itself. It was the combination of distance, flood-prone passages, and the sudden arrival of water from outside. When we speak of entering the dark, then, we should not imagine foolishness. We should imagine commitment. The darkness of Mossdale was familiar to those who had trained themselves to move through caves. It was part of the work. The young men entered because they had reason to enter. They continued because the trip called for it. The tragedy was not that they were drawn to darkness, but that water changed the cave behind them. Their youth adds an ache to the story, but it should not be used to make them seem naive. Youth and competence can exist together. A 17-year-old in a caving club may have more underground experience than a middle-aged person who has never gone beyond a lit tourist cave. A 19-year-old can be strong, skilled, and trusted in a hard trip. A 26-year-old can already be an experienced figure among younger cavers. The ages matter because of the lives lost, not because they explain the accident on their own. Mossdale was not waiting for inexperience. Mossdale was a flood-prone system, and the flood did not care how much ability was inside. As the afternoon moved on, the distance between the 6 men and the entrance increased not only in meters but in difficulty. Every crawl passed on the way in became a crawl that would need to be passed again on the way out. Every wet section became part of the return route. In normal conditions, this was expected. In flood, it became the central problem. The cave did not need to stop them everywhere. It only needed to stop them at the wrong places. That is the practical fear in a system like Mossdale. You may have air where you are, but the route back may no longer exist as a route for people. The 4 who had left the cave carried the last direct surface connection to the group still inside. Once they emerged, the difference between those outside and those inside became immense. Outside, the weather could be seen, the entrance could be checked, help could be raised. Inside, the 6 continued in a world defined by stone and water. The split between these two realities grew with every rise of the beck. What had begun as one party became two conditions, those who had reached daylight and those who had not. This is the human centre of the Mossdale story before the rescue begins. 6 young cavers, capable and committed, had gone into a cave that demanded respect. 4 others had left and then discovered that the entrance had flooded. The day turned from expedition to emergency, not with a loud announcement, but with the sight of water where the exit should have been. From that moment, the story no longer belonged only to the people underground. It spread across the moor to rescuers, clubs, families, and a caving community that would soon understand that Mossdale had become the kind of event everyone would remember. Above the cave, the weather had shifted from background detail to deciding force, and that is where the next part of the story waits, in the rain falling over Yorkshire, while the men below moved through passages that were already becoming harder to escape. Above the 6 men, the weather began doing something that would matter more than anything happening inside the cave. That is one of the hardest things about Mossdale to sit with. The danger was not only in the passage ahead of them, it was behind them, above them, and outside their knowledge. While they moved through the limestone, the moor was changing. Rain was falling. Water was gathering. Mossdale Beck, which could look like an ordinary stream in ordinary conditions, was beginning to rise. And because this was Mossdale, a rising beck was not just a surface problem. It was a direct threat to the route underground. Weather can feel harmless when it's still just weather. A darker sky, a little wind, rain tapping on the ground. Maybe someone pulling a hood up and deciding that summer in Britain is really more of a legal concept than a reliable season. On the surface, you can see it. You can step inside. You can change plans. You can look at the clouds and say, with great confidence and no actual authority, that it will probably pass over. But underground, weather becomes something else. It becomes water level. It becomes current. It becomes a passage losing airspace. It becomes the sound of a stream changing in the dark, and if the people underground do not know what is happening above, the weather has already become dangerous before it has become obvious. Mossdale was especially vulnerable because the cave was tied so closely to the beck. The water did not merely run past the cave like scenery beside a walking path. It sank into the system. In normal conditions, that was part of the cave's character. The stream entered the limestone, moved through passages, and continued through the hidden drainage beneath the moor. But after heavy rain, the same relationship became a hazard. The entrance was not only a doorway for people, it was a route for water. When the beck rose, the cave did not remain separate from the storm. The storm entered it. This is where surface thinking can mislead us. A person standing above a cave might imagine the underground as sheltered. After all, caves are below ground. They do not have rain falling directly into them the way a field does. There is no wet sky underground, no clouds, no wind pushing across the passage. But in a stream cave, shelter is not the same as safety. The rain may not fall on your helmet, but it can arrive at your knees, waist, chest, or roof level. It can come from behind. It can come through the route you need to use to leave. It can rise in places where standing up is impossible. It can make the safest direction impossible to take. The 6 men deeper in Mossdale were working through a system that already demanded time and effort. The cave was not a quick trip. It was not a short underground loop where a delayed exit might mean only a cold walk back to the car and a late supper. Mossdale's far reaches took hours to reach, and hours to leave. The men would have been far enough inside that the weather above was no longer part of their direct experience. They could not simply glance outside and reassess. They could not receive a warning from someone on the moor. They could not check a phone, because this was 1967, and even if modern phones had existed, caves have a long tradition of treating signals with complete indifference. The men had their knowledge, their route, their lamps, and the conditions they could observe where they were. Above them, the storm changed the time available. That is the practical cruelty of it. Underground, a team may think in terms of trip time. How long to the next section? How long to return? How much energy remains? how far to the entrance. But a flood introduces another clock altogether. Water rising outside does not wait for a team to finish its objective. It does not adjust itself to the pace of a crawl. It does not pause because someone is cold, tired, or still 2 miles from daylight. It moves according to rainfall, catchment, slope, and the shape of the cave. When those conditions are against you, the water can overtake human plans with terrible speed. In Mossdale, the issue was not only that rain fell. Rain falls often in the dales. The issue was that the rain came hard enough, and in the wrong place, to swell Mossdale Beck and flood the cave entrance. A thunderstorm can be especially dangerous in this sort of landscape, because it may deliver a lot of rain over a short period. The sky may not need to rain all day. It may only need to rain heavily for long enough over the catchment feeding the beck. Water gathers on the moor, runs into channels and moves downhill. In a limestone drainage system, it may then vanish underground with little ceremony. The surface stream becomes an underground flood. There is something unsettling about how ordinary the first signs may have been. Perhaps the sky darkened. Perhaps the rain struck the grass harder. Perhaps water began running in small lines across the ground, joining the beck. Sheep probably continued being sheep, because sheep are not known for issuing hydrological warnings. A person on the surface might have noticed the change and thought of getting indoors. But for the 6 men inside, the first meaningful sign would not have been the sky. It would have been the cave itself, the water in the passages, the current, the depth, the sound, the difference between what they expected and what they were beginning to meet. Cave flooding is frightening because it can turn familiar features into barriers. A low section that was passed earlier may no longer have air above the water. A crawl that was wet but manageable may become submerged. A stream that was noisy but crossable may become too forceful. The route out may remain physically close in distance yet unreachable in practice. This is one of those realities that makes caving risk so specific. In many places, if danger comes, moving faster may help. Underground moving faster is not always possible. The passage may only allow one speed. A person cannot sprint through a flat-out crawl. They cannot push past teammates easily in a narrow tube. They cannot force a flooded passage to offer air. The body is constrained by the shape of the rock. The men inside Mossdale were not at the entrance when the water rose. That matters. Had they been close to daylight, the situation might have been different. But deep inside a cave, delay is built into the environment. Even if a team decides to turn back immediately, the return can take hours. The journey out follows the same hard route as the journey in, now with fatigue added. Every crawl, every squeeze, every pool, every awkward corner must be negotiated again. If the flood reaches key parts of the route before the team does, then the decision to return may come too late through no lack of will. A blocked passage is not a problem solved by determination. Sometimes determination only carries a person to the place where the water has already taken control. Above ground, the 4 who had left the cave were now in a different situation. They had been underground too, but they had come out before the entrance was lost. That single fact separated their day from the fate of the others. It is difficult to think about because the difference between safety and disaster can sometimes be only timing. The 4 had reached daylight. The 6 had not. No great moral lesson sits neatly inside that division. It is not that one group deserves safety and the other did not. It is that in caves, timing can become everything. A passage passable at 1 hour may not be passable later. A stream low at the start of a trip may rise before the return. A decision that seemed reasonable under one set of conditions may be overtaken by conditions no one inside can see. When Morag Forbes returned to check the entrance and found it submerged, the weather above became a confirmed emergency. The entrance was not merely wet. It was blocked by floodwater. That sight would have carried immediate meaning for anyone who understood Mossdale. It meant that the 6 men were cut off. It meant that the cave had flooded between them and the surface. It meant that waiting casually was not an option. The danger had moved from possible to real, and because there was no instant way to reach them, the only thing left was to raise help. That moment is one of the most important in the whole story. A person sees water where the way out should be, understands what it means, and acts. In a modern emergency, we often imagine the first step as pressing a button, calling emergency services, sending a location, sharing a message. But on that moor in 1967, raising the alarm was physical. It meant crossing rough ground. It meant moving through bad weather. It meant getting to a place where a phone call could be made. The storm had not only trapped the men underground, it had also made the surface response harder. Darkness, rain, distance, and the remoteness of the site all became part of the same emergency. There is an old-fashioned toughness in that part of the story, though not in a loud way. Morag's run for help was not a dramatic rescue in itself, but without that first action, the organised response could not begin. Someone had to carry the news from the flooded entrance to the outside world. Someone had to turn a hidden danger into a known incident. That is how many rescues begin, with one person refusing to hope vaguely that things will sort themselves out. The beck had risen. The entrance had gone under. 6 people were still inside. Help was needed. By then, the weather had already done its main damage. It had changed the cave faster than the people inside could escape. But the full scale of the emergency was still unfolding. Rescue teams would need to gather. People would need to reach the site. The water at the entrance would need to be dealt with before anyone could even begin to search. And all the while, the 6 men remained somewhere beyond the flooded sections, beyond immediate reach, in a cave whose conditions were no longer those of the trip they had begun. This is one reason Mossdale became such a turning point. It showed that the danger of a flood-prone cave may not feel urgent at the moment of entry. It may develop while the team is already committed. Surface weather and underground distance can combine in the worst way. The team may be experienced, the route may be known, the objective may be reasonable, but if water rises behind them, experience alone cannot open a sump. The lesson is not that skill is meaningless. Skill matters enormously, but skill has limits when a cave's physical conditions change beyond what a human body can pass. The storm also revealed the importance of catchment thinking. A cave entrance is only the visible point of a much larger system. The water reaching that entrance may come from a wider area of moorland. A caver planning a trip cannot think only about the patch of sky directly overhead. They must think about where the water comes from, how fast the cave responds, whether the entrance takes a stream, and which passages become impassable first. This sounds technical, because it is. Caving safety is technical. It is built from details that may seem dull until they become life-saving. How much rain has fallen? How much is forecast? Is the ground already wet? Does the cave flood from the entrance inward? Are there high-level refuges? How long is the trip? How hard is retreat? These questions are not background. In a place like Mossdale, they are central. For the men inside, however, those questions had already narrowed to the immediate route. It is possible to imagine them becoming aware that the water was higher than expected. It is possible to imagine the difficulty of deciding how fast to retreat, how to move as a group, how to respond if familiar sections were changing. But we must be careful here. We do not know their exact conversations. We do not know every decision they made underground as the flood developed. A respectful telling should not invent certainty where the cave left none. What we can say is that the flood created conditions that prevented escape. We can say that water filled the crucial routes. We can say that the 6 were caught in one of the most dangerous situations caving can produce. The emotional weight of that is heavy, but the mechanics are plain. Rain fell. The beck rose. The entrance flooded. Water moved into the passages. The route out was cut off. The rescue could not begin properly until the water was lowered. Those facts do not need embellishment. They are enough. In fact, they are more frightening when left simple. A cave does not have to collapse. A lamp does not have to fail. a person does not have to make one obvious mistake. Sometimes the system itself, under flood, becomes impassable. It is also worth remembering the sound and confusion above ground. Heavy rain on open moor, people trying to assess the entrance, water rushing where cavers needed to go, news spreading from farm to police, from police to rescue contacts, from one caving group to another. In those first hours, the rescue was not yet the large organised effort it would become. It was a problem forming in real time. The entrance was underwater. The men were overdue and trapped beyond reach. The weather had turned a hard cave into a closed one. As evening moved toward night, the difference between above and below became sharper. Above ground, people could act, but they could not yet reach. Underground, the 6 men may have still had air in places, but not a route out. That separation is one of the defining features of the Mossdale tragedy. Help was possible in intention before it was possible in practice. Rescuers could gather, plan, dig, divert and prepare. But until the water level dropped or was forced away from the entrance, the cave remained closed against them. The storm had not only endangered the cavers, it had delayed the people trying to save them. In an ordinary rescue, time is always important. In a cave flood, time becomes even more severe. Cold water takes heat. Darkness affects judgment. Exhaustion builds. Airspace may be limited. The uncertainty of the trapped team's location adds another layer. Rescuers outside may not know exactly where to go, even if they can enter. They must balance urgency with the risk of creating more casualties. A flooded cave is not made safer by rushing blindly into it. Rescue courage has to be disciplined, because the cave will punish mistakes without caring whether they were made from bravery. The weather above Mossdale therefore did more than cause the accident. It shaped the entire rescue. It determined when people could enter, how they could enter, and what conditions they would face. The water had to be diverted from the cave. Trenches and dams would become part of the effort. Rescuers would work through the night in rain, mud and urgency, trying to reduce the flow enough to make entry possible. That part of the story belongs to the long rescue effort, but it begins here with the storm. Before the teams arrived in numbers, before the trenches were dug, before the cave was searched, the weather had already written the first hard terms. There is a quiet lesson in how quickly the surface can become part of the cave. We often divide the world into above and below because it helps us think clearly. The moor is above, the cave is below, the sky is outside, the passages are inside, but water ignores those categories, it connects them. A raindrop falling on the moor can become floodwater in a crawl. A thunderstorm in the open air can become a blocked route underground. The boundary between surface and cave is not a wall, it is a connection point. Mossdale Beck made that connection visible in the worst possible way. The 6 men had entered a cave that was already known as hard, but the storm turned difficulty into disaster. It removed the margin between effort and survival. A long wet crawl can be endured when there is air. A streamway can be crossed when the water is low enough. A hard return can be completed when the route remains open. But when floodwater takes the entrance and fills low passages, the cave no longer offers the same choices. The men were caught not simply by darkness, distance, or the length of the system, but by the sudden loss of the way back. As the alarm spread and rescuers began to move toward Mossdale, the moor was no longer just a landscape, it was the roof of an emergency. Every channel of water mattered. Every effort to divert the beck mattered. Every delay mattered. The storm had turned the cave entrance into a barrier, and the first task for those outside would be brutally practical. Get the water away, get the entrance open, and try to reach the men before the cave and the night made the answer final. The next hours would bring people from across the rescue and caving community, not into a simple search, but into a struggle against water, mud, darkness, and the narrow mouth of a cave that had become a trap. The entrance to a cave is usually the most reassuring part of the whole place. It is the place where daylight still exists. It is the way back. It is the reminder that the underground journey, however difficult, is connected to the ordinary world of grass, weather, voices, and fresh air. Even in a hard cave, the entrance has a kind of practical comfort. You may be muddy, you may be cold, you may already be questioning your weekend choices. But if the entrance is open behind you, the surface remains possible. At Mossdale, on that Saturday in June, the entrance stopped being a comfort. It became the first barrier that mattered. When Morag Forbes returned to the entrance and saw it submerged, the situation changed instantly. This was not a vague worry. It was not the ordinary concern that a caving party had taken longer than expected. A flooded entrance at Mossdale meant something specific. It meant Mossdale Beck had risen high enough to pour into the cave and block the route. It meant the 6 men still inside could not simply leave by the way they had entered. It meant that the cave, which had been difficult but passable, had closed behind them. In a place like Mossdale, that sight would have been enough to tell an experienced caver that every minute now mattered. It is important to picture the entrance plainly. Not as a huge dramatic mouth in a cliff, not as a cavern opening where people could gather comfortably beneath a stone arch and stare into the dark. Mossdale's entrance was low, practical, and tied directly to the stream. The beck sank there. Water did not have to travel far to become part of the cave. When the stream rose, the entrance was the first place where the surface and underground emergency became visible. What had been a way in and out became a flooded point of no passage. That is a simple sentence, but underground it is one of the worst sentences there is. For the 4 who had come out, the difference was brutally clear. They were outside, the 6 were not. That division had been made by timing and then sealed by water. It is difficult not to think about how small the difference may have seemed earlier. One group ends its trip, another continues. This can happen in caving without drama. People choose different objectives. Some turn back, some go farther. In ordinary conditions, everyone later meets again, perhaps tired, perhaps cheerful, perhaps ready for food that tastes far better than it has any right to taste simply because it is eaten after hours underground. But Mossdale had changed the meaning of separation. The 4 who left could stand under the sky. The 6 who continued were behind floodwater. Morag's run for help is one of the clearest human actions in the story. She did not have the comfort of waiting at the entrance and hoping the water would drop quickly. She understood that help had to be raised. The distance across the moor was not a small errand. It meant moving over rough ground in bad weather, carrying the knowledge that people were trapped behind rising water. Today we're used to thinking of emergencies as things that begin with a phone call from wherever we happen to be. A person can stand beside a road, pull out a phone, and send information almost instantly. On that day, at that place, the alarm had to travel on foot before it could travel through official channels. The first part of the rescue was a person crossing the moor. That detail makes the remoteness of Mossdale feel real. The cave was not in a city street, close to an ambulance station and a set of bright doors. It was on open ground in the Dales, where help had to be summoned, organised, and brought to the site. A cave rescue is never only about reaching the cave. It is also about bringing people, equipment, knowledge, and coordination to a place that may not want to be reached easily. In Mossdale's case, the first obstacle was not deep inside the system. It was at the entrance itself. Rescuers could gather, but the cave would not let them in. The entrance had become a trap in 2 directions. For those outside, it prevented rescue. For those inside, it prevented escape. That is one of the cruelest structures an accident can have. Everyone is close enough to know the other side exists, but not close enough to reach it. The people above ground knew 6 men were somewhere beyond the flooded passages. The men underground, if they had reached blocked sections on their return, would have known the route out was no longer open. Between them was water, moving through the natural channel that had made Mossdale what it was. At first, the practical task was clear, even if it was not easy. The water had to be reduced at the entrance. Mossdale Beck had to be diverted away from the cave mouth. There is nothing glamorous about that kind of rescue work, and that is exactly why it deserves respect. It meant digging. It meant mud, water, tools, people working in poor conditions, and the constant pressure of knowing why the work mattered. Rescue, in real life, often looks less like a heroic leap and more like a long struggle with a ditch. Someone has to move earth. Someone has to place stones, boards, or whatever can help. Someone has to manage flow. Someone has to watch whether the water is dropping. Someone has to think not only about getting in, but about whether getting in will simply put more people in danger. The rescuers who came to Mossdale were not facing a straightforward search. They were facing a live flood situation in a cave known to be severe. High water levels prevented access. The beck had to be diverted. Even then, water inside the system remained a problem. This is the part of cave rescue that can be hard for outsiders to understand. Help can arrive and still not be able to help immediately. The will is there. The people are there. The urgency is there. But the physical conditions decide what is possible. A flooded entrance is not moved aside by courage. A sump does not open because everyone is anxious. The cave must first become passable enough for rescuers to enter without becoming victims themselves. That balance between urgency and restraint is one of the hardest parts of rescue work. Every instinct says go now, move now, reach them now. But a cave in flood punishes uncontrolled urgency. Rescuers have to ask the cold questions. Can we enter? Will the water rise again? Is there enough airspace? Can we move through this section and still return? Are we adding more casualties? These questions can feel cruel when people are trapped, but they are the questions that keep a rescue from becoming a larger disaster. Mossdale demanded that kind of discipline from the start. As more people arrived, the scene above the cave became increasingly active. Cavers, rescue volunteers, local people, and officials were drawn into the effort. The rescue would become the biggest ever mounted in Britain, involving more than 300 people, but numbers alone do not solve a cave flood. 300 people cannot all enter a narrow cave. They cannot all work at the entrance at once. They must be organised into tasks. Some dig, some carry equipment, some coordinate. Some wait because waiting is also part of rescue, however unpleasant. Some offer local knowledge. Some bring technical knowledge of the cave. Some prepare for entry when the water allows it. The size of the response shows the seriousness of the incident, but the cave still narrowed everything down to a few hard practical problems. The entrance remained the focus because it was the lock on the whole system. Until water could be diverted, until levels dropped, until the passage became enterable, the rescue could not become a search. There is a painful helplessness in that. The trapped men were not far away in the sense of miles across a country. They were within the earth beneath the same moor, but underground distance is not measured only in miles. It is measured in passable space. If a section is flooded to the roof, the distance beyond it might as well be another world. The phrase, "the entrance became a trap," should not make us imagine that the cave had changed shape like a door slamming shut. In one sense, it had done something more ordinary and more terrible. It had filled with water where people needed air. That was enough. In caving, an airspace of a few inches can matter. A crawl with water below and air above may be miserable but possible. Remove the air, and the passage is no longer a route. It is no longer a crawl. It is a submerged tube. The change between survival and impossibility can be measured in the height of the water against the roof. The rescuers were working against a system that had no single switch. Diverting the beck could reduce the inflow, but the water already inside had to drain or fall. Passages farther in might remain flooded even after the entrance improved. The cave's drainage depended on its natural routes, and those routes had been overwhelmed. A trench outside could help, but it could not instantly empty every low section. This is why entry was delayed even after work began at the entrance. The rescue had to wait on water levels, and waiting in that situation was almost unbearable. For those outside, the mine must have kept returning to the 6 men. Where were they? Had they reached high ground in the cave? Were they together? Were they still alive? Could there be an air pocket, a chamber, a high-level passage where they had taken refuge? These questions mattered deeply, but the cave did not answer them from outside. Rescue teams had to work with what was known about the system, what could be guessed from the route, and what the water allowed. Bob Leakey, who knew Mossdale from its early exploration, would later become involved in the search, bringing his deep knowledge of the cave to the effort. In a place like Mossdale, that knowledge was not simply useful. It could guide where rescuers believed a trapped person might have gone, and where survival might still be possible. Yet before that search could happen, the entrance had to be won back from the beck. This is a very physical image. People outside in bad weather and fading light, trying to pull a stream away from the cave that naturally swallowed it. The water had taken the route it had always taken. Humans were trying to interrupt it, not permanently, not as engineers reshaping a valley for a grand project, just long enough to open a way into the dark, long enough to reach 6 people. There is something almost unbearably practical about that. The rescue began as a fight over where a stream would go. The Dales landscape, which had earlier seemed like the roof over the cave, was now part of the work site. The moor was not background. It was where the problem had to be handled. Rain, mud, drainage, access, and distance all shaped what people could do. Rescue teams had to bring equipment over rough ground. Communication had to be managed. Decisions had to move through a growing crowd without becoming confusion. At the same time, the cave entrance remained small, wet, and unforgiving. A large rescue can gather around a very narrow problem. Inside the cave, the conditions would have been defined by water and limited options. We should be careful not to invent scenes we cannot know. We do not know exactly what each man saw, said, or thought. We do not know the full sequence of their movements once the flood overtook them. What is known is that the flood made escape impossible, and that the bodies of 5 were later found in the far marathon crawls, with the 6th found later after further searching. Those facts tell us enough about how severe the situation became. They also remind us why the entrance mattered so much. The men were not lost in a simple sense. They were cut off. Being cut off underground is different from being lost. A lost person might still have open routes to search. A cut-off team may know exactly where the exit lies and still be unable to reach it. That distinction is important. Mossdale was not mainly a navigation disaster. It was a flood entrapment. The cave's known route back had become blocked by water. This is one reason the tragedy had such a powerful effect on caving safety. It showed that knowledge of the route, skill and strength could all be defeated if the cave flooded behind a party. Prevention had to happen before entry, through weather judgment and an understanding of flood response, because once the trap closed, rescue options became painfully limited. As the rescue developed, the entrance would have been watched constantly. Is the water dropping? Is the diversion working? Can someone get in? Is it safe enough? These questions would have repeated in different forms. A cave entrance in flood becomes almost like an instrument reading the state of the whole emergency. The level of the water tells rescuers whether the cave is still sealed. The force of the flow tells them how dangerous entry may be. Mud and debris show what the flood has carried. Every small improvement matters, but every improvement has to be tested against the risk of more rain, more water, and more delay. Night added another layer. Darkness on the surface is not the same as darkness underground, but it changes rescue work all the same. Lamps and vehicle lights replace daylight. People become colder and more tired. The moor becomes harder to move across. Communication becomes more awkward. Small tasks take more effort. In a cave incident, the surface team has to create a working environment where none exists naturally. There is no rescue station waiting at the entrance. There is open land, weather, mud, water, and people trying to impose order on an emergency. That order mattered because the rescue was not only a matter of bravery, it was a matter of coordination. The Upper Wharfdale Fell Rescue Association and the cave rescue organisation played central roles. Caving rescue depends on people who understand underground movement, not only general emergency response. A cave is too specific for ordinary assumptions. Stretchers may not fit, radios may not work well, routes may require crawling, climbing, swimming or diving. A rescuer must be able to protect themselves while trying to reach someone else. At Mossdale, before any of that could proceed deep into the system, the entrance itself demanded attention. There is a terrible contrast between the simplicity of the entrance and the complexity of what it represented. It was just one opening, one place where water entered rock. But because Mossdale had only that practical way in and out for the cavers, the flooded entrance controlled the whole story. It held back the rescuers. It held in the trapped men. It turned a cave system of many passages into a locked space. This is one of the reasons single-entrance flood-prone caves are treated with such caution. If the entrance goes, the margin goes with it. The word trap can sound intentional, and of course Mossdale had no intention. The cave was not waiting with a plan. Water rose because rain fell. The beck entered because that was its route. The entrance submerged because the system could not take the flow while remaining passable. But for the people inside and outside, intention did not matter. The effect was the same. The route was closed. The way back to daylight had vanished under water. In a way, the entrance became the point where two kinds of time met. Outside, rescuers worked by urgent time, counting minutes, organising people, trying to speed up whatever could be sped up. Inside, the men were subject to cave time, which is slower, harsher, and shaped by physical passage. The water added a third clock, the flood clock, and that one did not care about either human urgency or underground endurance. It rose, filled, blocked, and drained according to the landscape. The rescue had to wait for that clock while trying to influence it with trenches and diversion. That is a difficult kind of powerlessness, not complete helplessness, but not control either. The effort at the entrance also shows something important about rescue communities. People came because 6 lives were at stake. They came knowing that the work might be dangerous, exhausting, and unsuccessful. They came because that is what rescue groups do, and because the caving community understands that anyone underground may one day depend on others above. This mutual responsibility is one of the strongest parts of caving culture. The same people who explore caves also build the knowledge and systems needed to respond when something goes wrong. Mossdale tested the culture at a scale Britain had not seen before, yet the tragedy also exposed the limits of rescue. That is not a criticism of the rescuers, it is the lesson. Some underground emergencies become almost impossible once they have happened. Flooded entrances, long distances, cold water and blocked crawls leave very little room for intervention. The best rescue may still arrive too late because the cave prevents access. That is why prevention became such an important part of Mossdale's legacy. The entrance that became a trap taught cavers to think harder about whether an entrance could flood, how quickly, and what that would mean for anyone beyond it. As the water was diverted and the rescuers waited for conditions to improve, the emergency moved into its long, grinding phase. The first shock had passed. The entrance was flooded. The alarm had been raised. Teams were gathering. Work was underway. But the men were still unreachable. This is often the hardest part of a rescue story to narrate because the action becomes repetitive and practical. Digging, waiting, watching, checking, planning. But that's exactly how it was. Real emergencies do not move neatly from one dramatic moment to the next. They involve hours of labour in uncertainty. People become tired. Clothing becomes soaked. Mud gets everywhere. Information arrives incomplete. Hope and fear move side by side. The entrance slowly became more than a place in the landscape. It became the focus of everyone's attention, the small opening on which all possibility depended. If the water dropped enough, rescuers could enter. If it did not, they could only keep working outside. Somewhere beyond that entrance, beyond low crawls and flooded sections, were 6 young men whose route back had been taken by the same beck that had shaped the cave over countless years. The rescuers were trying to make that route exist again, not in theory, not on a survey, but in the only way that mattered, with air above the water, enough space to pass, and enough time to search. By the time entry finally became possible, the rescue had already been shaped by delay. The flooded entrance had forced everyone into a race they could not run directly. They had to remove water before they could move through it. They had to make the cave accessible before they could begin the deeper search. And when the first rescuers did go in, they were not entering a neutral space. They were entering a cave that had just flooded, a cave known for long, wet crawls and severe passages, a cave that could still become dangerous again. The entrance had opened, but Mossdale had not become safe. It had only allowed the next stage of the ordeal to begin, and the long night of rescue on the moor would carry the story from the flooded mouth of the cave into the difficult search beyond. By the time the alarm had spread beyond the moor, Mossdale was no longer only a cave entrance under a scar. It had become the centre of a rescue operation that would pull people out of homes, pubs, roads, farms, police stations, and caving clubs across the region. The call to the rescue teams came late on Saturday night, and by then the rescue had already lost the first and most valuable thing in any underground emergency: easy access. The entrance was flooded. The beck was still a threat. The 6 men were beyond reach. Everything that happened next had to begin with the same hard fact. Before anyone could search properly, before anyone could reach the passages where the men might be, before any rescuer could do the work they had come to do, the water had to be dealt with. The moor above Mossdale must have felt very different at night. In daylight, the dales can look open and readable, even when the weather is poor. At night, in rain, with water moving fast, the same ground becomes harder, colder, and less forgiving. The cave entrance was not a neat doorway with a rescue team able to gather comfortably around it. It was a wet, dangerous place at the base of a scar, with Mossdale Beck pouring toward the underground system. People arriving in the dark had to understand the situation quickly. 6 cavers were inside. The entrance was submerged. The beck had to be diverted. The cave was known to flood severely, and there was no simple way to know how much time remained, or whether the trapped men had found any place of safety deeper inside. This is where rescue becomes work, not drama. People often imagine rescue as a single brave action, someone going in, reaching the trapped and bringing them out. But at Mossdale, the first rescue action was not a heroic dash into the cave. It was digging. It was building dams. It was trying to persuade a stream to go somewhere else. It was standing in water and mud, moving earth, filling sandbags, strengthening barriers, and watching whether the water level dropped enough to allow entry. That sounds plain because it was. In emergencies, the necessary thing is often plain. Move the water, hold the dam, keep the pumps running, get more people, bring lights, bring ropes, bring food, find someone who knows the cave, find someone who can coordinate the next team, make a place on the moor where decisions can be made without everyone shouting into the rain at once. The rescuers had to create order in a place that had none prepared for them. A control area had to be set up. People had to be assigned tasks. Information had to be passed accurately. The cave entrance had to be watched. The condition of the beck had to be watched. Equipment had to be carried over difficult ground. Vehicles, tractors, pumps, and later heavy machinery became part of the effort. There were tents, hoses, trenches, dams, and people working in shifts. Some cavers were ready to go underground, but readiness did not mean they could enter. Mossdale was not waiting politely for the rescue teams to arrive. It was flooded, active, and still dangerous. The scale of the response grew because the task demanded it. More than 300 people would become involved, but a large number of people around a cave does not mean a large number can work at the same point. That is one of the strange problems of cave rescue. You may have many willing hands, but the cave reduces the work to narrow channels. Only so many people can dig at once. Only so many can move near the entrance. Only a small team can enter a tight passage. Others must wait, carry, prepare, rest, or support. Waiting can feel useless, but in a rescue it is part of the structure. Someone resting now may be needed later. Someone standing by may become the fresh strength for the next underground push. Someone carrying tea, food, fuel, or equipment may be just as necessary as the person wearing a helmet at the cave mouth. A rescue is a body with many parts, and not all of them look heroic from the outside. Through that first long night, the focus remained on water. Mossdale Beck had to be diverted away from its natural sink. A trench was dug to send the stream past the entrance, and dams were built and strengthened to keep the flow from overwhelming the work. First-hand accounts describe the force of the water against the dam and the need for machinery and constant labour to hold it. That image matters. The rescuers were not simply waiting for nature to calm down. They were actively trying to change the immediate conditions. They were trying to stop more water entering the cave so that what was already inside could drain enough for entry. It was a race, but a strange one, because nobody could run directly toward the finish. They had to dig their way toward the possibility of starting. There is a kind of frustration in that which is difficult to measure. People had come to save 6 men, but the first enemy was not distance into the cave. It was the entrance itself. The rescue teams could not simply push past it. They had to work with the land. Water had to be redirected. Pumps had to run. Sandbags had to be filled. Trenches had to carry enough flow. The dam had to hold. Every practical task had a human meaning behind it. A shovel of mud was not just a shovel of mud. A bag of sand was not just a bag of sand. Each one was part of trying to open the way to 6 people trapped underground. The weather did not make this kind. Rain had already caused the flood, and the risk of more water remained part of every decision. Rescuers knew that entering too soon could place them in the same danger as the men they were trying to reach. That is one of the harshest responsibilities in rescue work. The person in charge cannot be guided only by emotion. They must protect the rescuers as well as try to reach the trapped. That can mean delaying entry when every instinct says to move. It can mean pulling people out when water rises again, even when the search is incomplete. It can mean telling a strong, willing caver to wait because the cave is not safe enough yet. These decisions do not feel gentle to anyone involved, but they are necessary. Cavers are a particular kind of rescue community because many of them are rescuing people they might know. In a small sport, especially in the 1960s, names, clubs and faces overlapped. People at Mossdale were not responding to strangers in an abstract way. Many knew the missing men, knew their clubs, knew their friends, or knew the kind of trip they had attempted. Some may have caved with them. Some may have shared meals, surveys, arguments, and jokes with them. The rescue was technical, but it was also personal. That makes discipline even harder. When those trapped are your friends, patience can feel like betrayal, even when patience is the only safe option. As the hours passed, the rescue on the moor became a mixture of intense labour and painful uncertainty. Nobody outside could yet say with confidence what had happened inside. There may have been hope that the 6 had reached a high section. In cave floods, survival can sometimes depend on finding a place above the water, a chamber or even where air remains and where the water does not reach. Mossdale was not a simple tube. It had different levels, crawls, chambers, and passages. A person who knew the cave might imagine possible refuges. Hope can attach itself to such places. Perhaps they reached higher ground. Perhaps they waited it out. Perhaps the water would drop and they could still be found alive. Rescue work often runs on that kind of hope, even when the conditions are grim. You keep working because until the cave answers, you do not stop. There must also have been fear that the answer was already known. The flood had been severe. The entrance series had been completely submerged. Much of the cave had flooded. The men were deep inside, beyond long and difficult crawls. A trained caver at the entrance would understand what those facts could mean. But rescue does not operate on fear alone. It operates on possibility. If there is any reasonable chance, people work. They dig, carry, crawl, pump, and wait for the moment when action becomes possible. At Mossdale, that meant working through the night to open a way underground. When the water finally dropped enough for entry to be considered, the cave still did not become welcoming. It had recently flooded. Debris could have shifted. Passages could remain wet, unstable, or close to flooding again. The entrance, once passable, led into a system whose normal difficulty had not gone away. Mossdale was still Mossdale. The rescuers entering it had to face long crawls, cold water, and the knowledge that more rain could change everything once more. One recollection describes the cave becoming unnaturally still as the water dropped, which must have been unsettling in a system where water was normally part of the soundscape. Silence in a cave can be peaceful in some circumstances. In Mossdale that night, it could only have felt watchful and wrong. The first rescuers entering after the flood were moving into a changed cave. They were not exploring, they were searching under pressure. That changes the experience of a cave completely. An explorer may move with curiosity, noting passages and possibilities. A rescuer moves with an objective and a weight. Every delay has meaning. Every obstacle is not only inconvenient but potentially costly. Yet speed remains limited by the cave. You can only crawl as fast as the passage allows. You can only pass equipment forward at the pace of the team. You can only communicate as well as the environment permits. In a tight cave, urgency does not widen the walls. The underground rescue also required judgment about team size. In narrow passages, sending too many people forward can create danger. If a team meets trouble and needs to turn around, a crowded crawl can become a problem in itself. Rescuers had to think about where to hold people back, where to send small groups ahead, and how to keep a line of support without jamming the passage. This is not the sort of difficulty that appears in ordinary rescue stories, but underground it can decide what is possible. The cave's shape becomes part of command structure. A low crawl may dictate team size more firmly than any human leader. As teams moved in, communication had to be maintained as well as possible. Cave telephones and lines could be laid, but that work took time and effort. Carrying a communication line into a wet, awkward system is not like plugging in a device on a desk. The line has to be taken through the cave, protected as much as possible and kept usable. It can snag, break, or become difficult to manage. Yet communication matters because the surface needs to know what teams find, and underground teams need to know if conditions outside are changing. At Mossdale, where more rain could threaten the rescue itself, communication was more than convenience. It was safety. The rescuers also faced the emotional strain of not knowing what they would find. A rescue team goes in hoping for life, but trained enough to face death. That is a heavy combination. In Mossdale, the hope must have narrowed as the search moved deeper. The evidence of flood would have been everywhere. Debris, watermarks, mud, disturbed belongings. The raw signs of a cave that had recently carried far more water than it should for human passage. Those signs speak in a language cavers understand. They show how high the water went, where it moved strongly, what it carried, and which sections would have been impossible to pass. Each sign would have made the situation clearer and more painful. Outside, the moor remained active. Pumps worked. People supported the dams. Food and drink were supplied. Volunteers waited for their turn or returned from underground exhausted. Vehicles moved where they could. Officials gathered information. Family and friends would have been drawn into the widening circle of fear. News of the incident spread. What had begun as a hidden emergency under a remote scar became a national story. Yet on the ground, the work stayed stubbornly local and practical. Hold back the water, send in the teams, bring out information, keep people safe enough to continue. The phrase "long night" does not only mean hours of darkness, it means the length of not knowing. It means the stretch of time in which everyone works without the answer they need. It means cold hands, wet clothes, tired bodies, and minds turning over the same questions again and again. Where are they? Could they be alive? How far has the water gone? Will the dam hold? Will more rain come? How soon can the next team enter? When will the cave tell us what happened? Time in that sort of rescue does not pass neatly. It drags during waiting and then rushes during action. A few minutes can feel like too little time when the water changes, and too much time when the cave remains silent. By Sunday, entry into the system became possible, but possible did not mean simple. Teams had to move into Mossdale under conditions that were still hazardous. The known route toward the far parts of the cave involved hard sections even in ordinary circumstances. The rescue teams were not fresh explorers on a planned trip. They were people who had already been working, waiting, worrying and preparing through a difficult night. Some had travelled long distances after being called out. Some had spent hours on the surface tasks before going underground. Fatigue was part of the rescue too, and fatigue underground is not a small matter. It affects warmth, patience, movement and judgment. Good rescue organisation has to account for that, rotating people and using fresh teams when possible. Eventually rescuers reached the area where 5 of the missing men were found. That discovery changed the nature of the operation. Hope did not vanish entirely, because one man was still unaccounted for, but the rescue had crossed into recovery for most of the group. That is a terrible transition. Until bodies are found, there is a space, however narrow, for the mind to imagine survival. Once they are found, that space closes. The rescuers who made the discovery had to carry that knowledge back through the cave and to the people waiting outside. No message like that is easy. In a cave rescue, even grief has to travel through crawls, water, radios, lines, and tired human voices. Bob Leakey's involvement later in the search for the missing 6th caver shows how personal and knowledgeable the rescue became. Leakey was not just another name at Mossdale. He was deeply connected with the cave's exploration. He knew the system in a way few people did. When one man remained missing, the question became whether he might have reached a possible refuge or been carried somewhere less obvious by the flood. Leakey helped lead a search toward places where survival might have been imagined. That effort says something about the refusal to stop too soon. Even when the odds were poor, rescuers looked. They followed possibilities until the cave and conditions forced limits. At the same time, the cave kept reminding everyone of its danger. Reports described teams being ordered out when water began rising again, or when there were problems with the dam. That is the kind of detail that makes the rescue feel immediate. The danger did not end because rescuers had entered. The system could still flood. The people searching for the missing were themselves vulnerable to the same force. Every underground team had to remain aware that Mossdale could close again. This is what makes cave rescue in flood-prone systems so severe. The accident scene can still be active. The trap that caught the original party can still threaten the rescuers. The surface effort therefore continued even after entry was possible. Pumps, dams, trenches and people remained essential because the rescue depended on keeping the entrance and early passages passable. A cave rescue in such a situation is not a single line of people going in. It is a whole machine of human effort above and below ground, each part supporting the other. Underground teams search, surface teams manage water, communication teams pass information, support teams carry equipment and food, leaders make decisions, volunteers keep working long after they are cold and tired. It is a system built quickly under pressure, and at Mossdale it had to be built on a wet moor in the aftermath of a storm. The emotional atmosphere must have been very hard to bear. Cavers are often practical people, used to discomfort and problem solving. But practicality does not cancel grief. It only gives grief something to do for a while. Filling a sandbag can be easier than standing still with fear. Carrying equipment can be easier than waiting for news. Going underground can be easier than imagining what might be happening there. Work gives shape to distress. At Mossdale, there was so much work that people kept moving, but each task was tied to the same terrible question. When people later remembered the rescue, many spoke of the effort and commitment of those who came. There is no comfort large enough to balance what happened, but there is meaning in the response. People did not turn away because conditions were hard. They did not decide that the cave was too difficult and leave the men to fate without trying. They came in numbers. They worked through the night. They used tractors, pumps, trenches, dams, ropes, lamps, telephones, and their own bodies. They entered a cave that many feared and that still threatened to flood. They searched because that is what the situation required, and because the people inside were part of their community. The long night on the moor was therefore not only a rescue attempt, it was a picture of caving culture under its greatest strain. The same qualities that make caving possible were present there: teamwork, endurance, technical knowledge, local experience, and trust. But Mossdale also showed the limit beyond which even those qualities may not be enough. That is why the tragedy had such force afterward. It did not happen because no one cared. It did not happen because help failed to arrive. Help arrived in extraordinary numbers. The problem was that the cave had flooded, and in those first critical hours the entrance itself prevented rescue. The rescuers were fighting a situation that may already have become unsurvivable before they could reach the men. As the operation moved from Saturday night into Sunday and then beyond, the rescue became heavier with each discovery. 5 found, 1 still missing. Search teams going in again. Surface teams still managing water. The coroner, police, rescue leaders and cavers all facing decisions that no one wanted to make. The moor that had been alive with urgent hope now had to carry grief, exhaustion and unresolved duty. The work was not finished, because one man had not yet been located, and because the question of what to do once all were found would become its own painful matter. Mossdale had taken 6 lives, and now the people above had to decide how far they could safely go in bringing them back, while the cave remained narrow, wet, unstable in flood conditions, and dangerous enough to challenge every instinct of friendship and responsibility. When the rescuers finally pushed far enough into Mossdale to find the missing men, the story changed in a way that everyone on the moor must have feared, even while they kept working against it. Until that point, hope had still been present. It may have been thin. It may have been bruised by the evidence of the flood, by the time that had passed, by the reports coming back from inside the cave, and by the knowledge of what water could do in those low passages. But hope is stubborn in rescue work. It stays because people need it to keep moving. It stays because no one wants to give up while there is still any chance. It stays because somewhere in a difficult cave there might be a high ledge, a pocket of air, a dry chamber, a place where trapped people could wait. At Mossdale, that hope slowly met the facts waiting in the dark. The rescuers found 5 of the men in the far marathon crawls. The name itself is almost painfully fitting. Marathon suggests length, effort and endurance, and in Mossdale it meant more than a casual description. This was not a place near the entrance where help could arrive quickly. It was deep inside a hard system, reached through passages that were difficult even before floodwater had moved through them. The rescuers who found them had to carry the knowledge back through the cave, through all the awkward, wet, narrow ways that had delayed the rescue from the beginning. Bad news does not travel easily underground. It has to be spoken into the practical machinery of a rescue. It has to pass from caver to caver, from underground team to surface command, from rescue leaders to families and friends. Each step carries its own weight. 5 found did not mean the work was over. One of the 6, John Ogden, was still missing. That fact kept the operation open, and with it came another difficult form of hope. If one man had not been found with the others, there was still a possibility, however uncertain, that he had gone elsewhere. Perhaps he had reached a place of air. Perhaps he had moved away in search of a route. Perhaps the flood had carried him, or perhaps he had found a refuge that the search had not yet reached. In cave rescue, especially in a complicated system, the unknown is never empty. It fills itself with possibilities, and rescuers have to test those possibilities as far as the cave allows. Bob Leakey was called on because he knew Mossdale in a way few people did. He had been central to its early exploration, and his understanding of the system mattered deeply. He was in his 50s by then, no longer the young explorer who had helped open the cave's secrets decades earlier. But Mossdale was part of his own history. He led a search party toward a place where he thought the missing man might have survived. That decision says a great deal about the rescue. They were not simply following a checklist. They were using memory, cave knowledge, experience and judgment. They were asking where a trapped caver might go. Where could there be air? Where could someone wait? Where had the flood gone? And where had it perhaps not gone? But Mossdale remained dangerous. Leakey's search party had to retreat because of the risk of flooding. That detail is important because it shows that the cave had not become safe just because rescuers were inside it. The same system that had trapped the 6 men still threatened those searching for them. More water, a failing dam, rising levels, or changing conditions could have turned the rescue into another disaster. There are times in rescue work when continuing feels morally necessary but physically impossible. Mossdale forced that kind of decision. The desire to find John Ogden had to be balanced against the risk to the people still alive. That is not a simple balance. It is one of the heaviest responsibilities any rescue leader can carry. The 6th body was found later. With that, the last possibility of survival was gone. The 6 who entered and continued deeper into Mossdale had all died. Dave Adamson, Jeff Boyrow, Bill Frakes, John Ogden, Michael Ryan and Colin Vickers did not return to the surface. Their names became attached forever to the cave, but each of them had existed before the tragedy as more than a name in a list. They were sons, friends, club members, students, young men with ordinary futures expected ahead of them. The cave story is the reason we speak of them now, but it was not the whole of who they were. A respectful telling needs to remember that. A person's final day should not be allowed to swallow the entire life that came before it. It can be tempting, when telling a story like this, to focus only on the physical facts. Where they were found, how far in, which passage, what the rescue did next. Those things matter, and they must be told accurately. But there is another side to the facts, the people waiting above. Families, friends, and the wider caving community had to receive news that no one wanted to hear. For them, Mossdale was not an example of flood risk or a case study in rescue logistics. It was loss. The technical details explain how the tragedy happened, but they do not soften what it meant. 6 young men had gone into the cave and were not coming home. The rescue teams then faced a question that must have felt almost impossible. Could the bodies be brought out? In many rescue stories, recovery is assumed. The dead are returned to their families. The operation ends with the difficult but important act of bringing them back into daylight. At Mossdale, the cave made even that uncertain. The route was long, wet, narrow and dangerous. Some sections were extremely constricted. Flood risk remained. Removing bodies through such a system would have exposed rescuers to severe danger. The question was no longer whether people wanted to bring them out. Of course they did. The question was whether doing so would risk more lives. That is a brutal kind of decision. From outside caving, it may be hard to understand why recovery could be impossible or too dangerous. We're used to thinking that determination, equipment, and enough people can solve almost anything. But caves do not work that way. A passage may be only large enough for a living caver to crawl through with difficulty, using their own movement and judgment. A body cannot help. A stretcher may not fit. A flooded section may rise again. A rescuer carrying or dragging weight through a tight crawl is far more vulnerable than a caver moving freely. Every meter becomes harder. Every constriction becomes a problem. Every delay increases exposure to cold, fatigue, and flood risk. The cave's shape decides what is possible more firmly than human feeling does. The coroner decided that it was too dangerous to bring the bodies out, and the entrance was sealed. Concrete was poured down the only safe entrance. That fact is one of the most striking parts of Mossdale's aftermath. The cave became, for a time, a tomb. not because no one cared enough to recover the men, but because care had to include the lives of the rescuers. It is a decision that still feels heavy. There is no version of it that feels comfortable. Leaving the dead underground is hard to accept. Sending more people into a cave where 6 had already died could have been worse. The coroner's decision recognised that the tragedy could not be allowed to expand because of the human need to complete a recovery in the usual way. The sealing of the entrance also changed Mossdale symbolically. A cave entrance usually means possibility, entry, exploration, return. Sealing it meant closure, but not closure in the emotional sense. More like a physical statement that the system had become too dangerous, too full of loss, too closely tied to the accident to remain open in the ordinary way. The concrete did not erase Mossdale. It did not erase grief. It did not erase the questions cavers would continue to ask. But it marked the cave as a place where the normal relationship between caver and passage had been broken. In 1971, the entrance was reopened for a different purpose. With the agreement of the families, colleagues from the University of Leeds Speleological Association moved the bodies to mud caverns, a chamber at the far end of the system, where they were buried inside the cave. That act deserves careful attention. It was not a rescue in the ordinary sense. It was not exploration. It was not sport. It was an act of duty by people who understood the cave, understood the men, and understood the meaning of leaving them in a more fitting place within the underground system. It required entering Mossdale again, carrying out a solemn task in a place that had already taken so much. This burial inside the cave may seem unusual to those outside the caving world, but in context it carries a certain quiet logic. The men had died in Mossdale. The danger of bringing them fully out had been judged too great. Their families agreed to the arrangement. Their colleagues, people from their own underground community, carried out the work. Mud caverns became not simply another chamber on a survey, but a burial place. The cave held them, not as lost bodies in inaccessible crawls, but as men deliberately laid to rest by those who knew what the place meant. There is no need to make that sound grander than it was. In fact, it is more powerful when described plainly. Cavers went back in. They moved their friends. They buried them inside the system. They did so with family agreement. They did so because there was no easy answer, and this was the answer that could be made with care. It was a practical act, a respectful act, and a difficult one. It shows again that caving culture is not only about pushing into hard places, it is also about responsibility to the people who enter those places together. The 6 men's deaths became the most deadly incident in British caving. That phrase is accurate, but it can also flatten the story if we use it too quickly. Most deadly is a statistic. Mossdale was more than a statistic. It became a reference point, a warning, a sorrow, and a turning moment. Cavers would speak of it in future not only because of the number who died, but because of how they died. Trapped by floodwater in a known difficult cave, beyond an entrance swallowed by the beck. The accident was specific enough to teach lessons and severe enough to make those lessons impossible to ignore. For rescuers, the memory must have included both effort and helplessness. More than 300 people were involved, and yet the flood had created conditions that made reaching the men in time impossible. That's a hard truth for any rescue community. Rescue teams train to act. They exist because action matters. At Mossdale, action did matter. It raised the alarm, diverted water, opened the cave, searched the passages, located the men, and prevented further casualties. But action could not undo what the flood had already done. It could not make the entrance passable earlier. It could not widen the crawls. It could not return air to the passages at the time when the 6 needed it. Rescue work sometimes ends with the terrible knowledge that everyone did all they could, and it still was not enough. For the caving community, the 6 became part of a shared memory. Their names were written, spoken, and marked. A memorial plaque was placed above the entrance, and a cairn on the moor marks the place above where the bodies were found. These memorials matter because caves hide things by nature. They are underground. They keep their events out of sight. A cairn and plaque bring memory back to the surface, where people can stand, read, and remember. The cave remains below, but the names are not left only in the dark. There is something especially moving about a memorial above a cave. It reminds us that the landscape has layers of meaning. A walker crossing the moor may see grass, stone, and sky. A caver may see the roof of a known system. A family member may see the place connected to a life lost. A rescue volunteer may remember cold, mud, water, and the work of that night. The same piece of ground can hold all of those meanings at once. Mossdale is not only geology, it is also memory placed into landscape. The phrase "never came back" is simple, and perhaps that is why it stays with us. It does not exaggerate, it does not explain. It just states the line the story crossed. 6 men entered the cave and did not return. Everything else, the geology, the weather, the rescue, the coroner's decision, the burial, the memorial, and the safety changes, grows from that fact. It is the centre that should not be buried under technical detail. Technical detail helps us understand, but the human fact is why understanding matters. We should also be careful about how we speak of blame. Tragedies often make people look for a single place to put responsibility. A decision, a forecast, a warning missed. A person who should have acted differently. Sometimes that search is necessary and reveals clear failures. With Mossdale, the broad lesson became flood risk, weather judgment, and the dangers of long trips in stream caves vulnerable to rapid flooding. But turning the 6 men into careless figures would not be accurate or respectful. They were capable cavers in a severe cave on a day when weather and water changed the system behind them. The lessons are real, but they do not require harshness toward the dead. That is one of the reasons Mossdale has remained so serious in caving history. It is not an easy cautionary tale where the answer is simply, do not be foolish. The harder lesson is that skilled people can die when conditions outrun judgment and rescue access. The harder lesson is that a cave's entrance can be the most important hazard. The harder lesson is that weather above ground may be more dangerous than anything visible underground at the start of a trip. The harder lesson is that sometimes the safest rescue decision may still feel wrong to the heart. After the bodies were found and the immediate rescue ended, the story did not truly end. It changed form. It moved into reports, conversations, club meetings, safety decisions, rescue training, family grief, and public memory. Mossdale became a name cavers carried with them when judging flood-prone systems. It became part of how people talked about weather before trips. It became part of the argument for stronger caution around caves where water could block exits. It became a reminder that an underground objective, however interesting, must always be weighed against the conditions that might exist hours later on the return. The 6 who never came back therefore changed the future by the fact of their loss. That is a painful kind of legacy. No one chooses it. No family would ask for it. No community wants to learn by losing its young. But in dangerous activities, some lessons arrive with names attached, and those names must be remembered with more than a quick warning. Dave Adamson, Jeff Boero, Bill Frakes, John Ogden, Michael Ryan, and Colin Vickers became part of caving history because Mossdale took them. The right response is not only fear, it is care. Care in telling the story, care in planning future trips, care in reading weather, care in respecting water, care in knowing when a cave should not be entered. As the rescue operation ended and the decisions about the cave settled into place, Mossdale no longer meant what it had meant before. It had once been a hard system, a challenge, a possible route toward the hidden drainage of Black Held, a place that drew explorers because it was difficult and unfinished. After the tragedy, it became something else as well. It became a boundary marker in British caving. There was caving before Mossdale, and then there was caving after Mossdale with the same limestone hills and the same underground streams, but a different awareness carried by those who entered the dark. After Mossdale, caving could not look at floodwater in quite the same way again. That does not mean cavers before 1967 had been careless about water. They were not children wandering about with candles and optimism, hoping the underground world would be kind if they smiled at it nicely. Many knew very well that caves could flood, that streams could rise, and that limestone systems could become dangerous faster than a person wanted to believe. But some tragedies become fixed points in a culture. They turn a known risk into a remembered one. They take something that people understood in theory and give it names, dates, faces, rescue reports, and a place on a moor where the lesson cannot be brushed aside. Mossdale did that. It made flood risk impossible to treat as a minor inconvenience. It showed that water was not only one hazard among many, like loose rock, tiredness, lamp failure, or getting a knee wedge somewhere. It had no strong desire to remain. Water could become the whole event. It could block the entrance, fill low passages, delay rescuers, divide a party from daylight, and make even the strongest underground team helpless. The tragedy was not just that 6 men died in a cave. It was that they were experienced, capable cavers in a known hard system, and still the flood overtook the situation. That made Mossdale more than a warning to beginners. It became a warning to everyone. One of the clearest changes was the way cavers thought about weather before entering flood-prone systems. The sky above a cave became part of the cave. That may sound obvious now, but Mossdale made it painfully practical. A caver planning a trip could not simply ask what the passage looked like at the entrance. They had to ask what the catchment was doing, how much rain had fallen already, how wet was the ground, was more rain forecast, could thunderstorms develop during the hours underground, how quickly did the cave respond to rainfall, which passages would sump first, would the entrance itself become impassable. These were no longer background thoughts. In serious stream caves, they became central questions. The time underground mattered too. Mossdale was not a short system. A return trip to the far end could take many hours, and that changed how weather had to be judged. A cave might look safe at midday, but the return might happen in evening conditions after rain has crossed the moor. A caver is not planning only for the entrance moment. They are planning for the whole span of the trip. In flood-prone caves, the safe window has to cover the inward journey, the objective, the return, and a margin for delay. Because caves are very good at creating delays, a tackle bag catches. Someone tires. A route takes longer than expected. A crawl that was awkward on the way in becomes deeply personal on the way out. Weather judgment has to allow for the cave being difficult, not for the trip going perfectly. Mossdale also strengthened the idea that an exit is not just a place, it is a condition. An entrance can exist on a map and still be useless if water fills it. A passage can be known and still be impossible if the airspace is gone. A route can be familiar and still become a trap. This became one of the deep lessons carried into future caving practice. When a party enters a single entrance cave that floods, they are not only asking whether they can reach their destination, they are asking whether the entrance will still be usable when they return. That is a different kind of thinking. It puts the return at the centre of the plan, not as an afterthought. Another change was cultural. Mossdale gave cavers a stronger language for saying no. That may sound small, but in exploration communities it matters enormously. People who love difficult places are often drawn by challenge. They admire commitment. They respect endurance. They remember people who push farther and return with new survey, new passages, or new understanding. Those qualities can be valuable, but they need to be balanced by an equal respect for turning back. After Mossdale, the decision not to enter a flood-prone cave because the weather was uncertain became easier to defend. It was not timidity, it was good judgment. The storm above Mossdale had shown what could happen when a long trip and rising water met at the wrong time. This is one of the quiet ways safety cultures change. Not always through one new rule written in large letters, though rules certainly matter. They also change through conversations before trips. Someone says, The forecast looks unsettled. Someone else says, "It might be fine." Then another voice says, "Not for that cave." That voice becomes stronger when a place like Mossdale is remembered. The name itself becomes part of the discussion. It carries the weight of what water can do. It helps make caution respectable, even among people who pride themselves on toughness. And honestly, toughness without caution is not very useful underground. It is just a person being cold in a difficult place with too much confidence. Cave rescue thinking was affected as well. Mossdale showed the limits of even a huge response when floodwater blocks access. More than 300 people were involved, and the commitment was extraordinary, but the rescuers could not reach the trapped men until the water allowed entry. That fact is not a failure of rescue. It is a fact about caves. It taught a hard lesson. The best rescue is sometimes the one that never has to happen. Rescue teams can organise, train and respond with skill, but if a cave has flooded shut, human effort begins at a disadvantage. Prevention, planning and conservative judgment are not less dramatic parts of rescue. They are the first line of rescue long before anyone is called out. The operation also underlined the need for coordination. A large cave rescue is not simply a matter of many brave people arriving. It requires leadership, communication, control points, team rotation, equipment management, medical readiness, surface support, and underground knowledge. Mossdale's rescue involved fell rescue and cave rescue working together, with local cavers, volunteers, machinery, pumps, and many support roles. The incident made clear that cave rescue must be organised before disaster happens. A flooded cave is too difficult a place to begin inventing a system from scratch. Teams need call-out procedures, training, maps, equipment, and a shared understanding of who makes decisions when conditions are changing quickly. Communication became another lasting concern. In a remote cave rescue, especially before modern phones and digital systems, information could move slowly. The alarm at Mossdale had to be raised by someone physically crossing the moor. Even after teams gathered, communication between surface and underground was difficult. Cave telephones and lines could help, but setting them up in a wet, awkward system took time and effort. In the years that followed, rescue organisations continued improving ways to pass information underground and coordinate large responses. Communication may not sound as thrilling as rope work or diving, but in rescue it is often what keeps bravery from becoming confusion. Call-out procedures also gained importance. If a caving party is overdue, someone on the surface needs to know when to act. This is now a basic part of responsible caving. Leave a route plan, a party list, an expected return time, and a clear instruction about when to raise the alarm. That does not mean every delayed party is in danger. Cavers can be late for many reasons, including slow progress, route finding, equipment problems, or the ancient underground tradition of underestimating how long everything takes. But a reliable call-out gives rescuers a starting point. It turns uncertainty into action before too much time is lost. Mossdale showed how important early alarm can be, especially in a flood-prone cave where delay may decide what is possible. Trip planning became more serious around the idea of safe refuges as well. Before Mossdale, some believed that if floodwater rose, cavers could wait in known high places until it dropped. In some caves, in some conditions that can be true, but Mossdale challenged any easy confidence in that idea. Knowing of a possible refuge is not enough if the team cannot reach it. If the flood arrives too quickly, if the water rises higher than expected, or if the route to that refuge is cut off. A safe place inside a cave must be considered carefully. Where is it? How quickly can it be reached? Is it above known flood levels? Is there enough air? Can rescuers reach it afterward? A vague hope of sitting out a flood is not a rescue plan. Mossdale made that clear. Access decisions changed too. Mossdale itself became legally inaccessible to ordinary cavers, with permission no longer granted because of the tragedy. That is a major shift in the life of a cave. A system that once represented exploration and challenge became a place where access was restricted because the risk and the memory were too great. Cavers may still discuss the system, study its surveys and understand its hydrology, but the official stance carries the weight of what happened. It says that some places are not only difficult, they are dangerous enough and historically painful enough that permission cannot be treated like a normal arrangement. This raises a difficult issue in caving more generally. Cavers value access. They do not want caves closed unnecessarily. Exploration, science and sport all depend on being able to enter underground systems. But access carries responsibility. If the caving community wants landowners, national park authorities and the public to trust it, then it must show that it takes risk seriously. Mossdale became part of that conversation. It showed that the consequences of an accident extend far beyond the people directly involved. Families suffer, rescue teams are put at risk, landowners are drawn into difficult decisions, public opinion can turn against the activity. A cave accident is never only private. Public perception mattered after Mossdale. To many people outside the caving world, the tragedy may have made caving seem reckless or incomprehensible. Why would anyone go there? Why enter a place where water could trap you? These are natural questions from the surface. Cavers then had to explain that their activity was not a careless flirtation with disaster, but a disciplined sport and field science that required knowledge, training, and judgment. Mossdale made that explanation harder in one sense, because the outcome was so terrible, but it also made it more necessary. The caving world had to show that it could learn, adapt, and speak honestly about risk. Honesty is important here. Safety culture does not improve by pretending dangerous things are safe. It improves by knowing exactly how they are dangerous. A cave like Mossdale cannot be made safe by cheerful language. It must be described plainly, seriously flood-prone, severe, difficult, with passages that can fill to the roof not far from the entrance. That kind of warning is useful because it is specific. It does not merely say, "Be careful," which is sometimes the least helpful safety advice in the world. Sitting somewhere between "don't fall" and "try not to drown" do. It says what can happen, where it can happen, and under what conditions. Specific warnings help people make real decisions. The tragedy also helped reinforce the idea that caving skill includes restraint. Skill is not only the ability to move through hard passages, it is not only knowing knots, surveys, lamps, ladders, ropes, and how to make peace with mud in places mud should never be. Skill also means knowing when the correct trip is no trip. It means accepting that a cave will still be there another day, while people may not be if they choose badly. This sounds simple, but it can be hard in practice. People travel long distances, they arrange weekends, they gather teams, they look forward to objectives. Turning around because of uncertain weather can feel disappointing. Mossdale is one of the reasons that disappointment is treated as a small price. Training gains sharper meaning after incidents like this. Newer cavers had to be taught not only how to move underground, but how to think about the whole system around a cave. Weather, hydrology, group management, emergency planning, hypothermia and rescue call-outs are not extra topics for people who enjoy paperwork. They are part of the activity. A caver who can crawl strongly but cannot judge flood risk is not fully prepared for a stream cave. A group that has lights and enthusiasm but no clear surface call-out has left a gap in its safety. Mossdale made these gaps harder to ignore. Equipment improved over time as well, though Mossdale was not the only reason. Caving gear in the decades after the 1960s became better, lighter, warmer and more specialised. Wetsuits, oversuits, helmets, lamps, ropes, bags, and emergency equipment developed. Better gear does not remove cave danger, but it changes survival margins. Warmth matters in cold water. Reliable lighting matters in long systems. Proper clothing matters during delay. Emergency food, spare lights and survival equipment can matter if a party is trapped. Mossdale did not teach that equipment alone could save people. In fact, it taught the opposite in some ways. but it did reinforce that long, wet, flood-prone caves require serious preparation, not casual kit. Cave rescue training also continued to develop around the reality that underground rescue is specialised. Moving an injured person through a cave is slow and technical. Searching in a flooded or recently flooded cave is even harder. Rescuers must understand not only first aid and physical rescue, but cave movement, water hazards, rigging, communication, and team safety. Mossdale showed that a major incident can involve hundreds of people, while still depending on a handful of skilled underground teams in the tightest sections. It showed the need for practice systems, not just good intentions. The legacy also touched the way cavers talk about ambition. Before Mossdale, as after it, difficult systems carried status. Hard trips were admired. Long crawls, deep roots, severe caves, and new discoveries all had a place in caving identity. That did not disappear. Caving would not be caving if everyone decided the correct approach was to admire cave entrances from a safe distance, and then go for a nice bun. But Mossdale helped temper ambition with a stronger sense of consequence. Exploration remained valuable, but the question became not only, can we get through? It became, should we go today? And what happens if water rises? And can we get out if the cave changes? Those are mature questions. They do not weaken exploration. They make it possible to continue responsibly. There is also a legacy in memory itself. Mossdale became one of the stories told to new cavers, sometimes formally, sometimes in club huts, pubs, rescue training, or quiet conversations before trips. Such stories are not meant to frighten people away from caves. They are meant to teach seriousness. Every activity with real risk has these stories. Mountaineers have storms and avalanches, sailors have sudden weather and bad seas, divers have depth, gas, and entanglement. Cavers have flood, darkness, cold, and the shape of rock. Mossdale became part of caving's shared memory because it joined all of those underground dangers in one terrible event. Remembering Mossdale properly also means avoiding simple hero worship or simple blame. The six were not careless caricatures. The rescuers were not miracle workers who failed, nor were they anything less than committed. The cave was not evil. The weather was not dramatic for the sake of a story. What happened was a real event made of real conditions. A severe cave, a rising beck, trapped cavers, delayed access, enormous rescue effort, and loss. The lessons come from the reality, not from adding extra drama. In safety, plain truth is stronger than exaggeration. The phrase "changed caving forever" can sound large, but in this case the change was not one single switch thrown across the whole sport. It was a deepening of caution. It was a strengthening of rescue organisation. It was a sharper respect for flood-prone systems. It was the closing of Mossdale to legal access. It was better conversations about weather and call-outs. It was a lasting example, used whenever someone needed to explain that a cave can become impossible behind you. Change often works like that. Not as one grand announcement, but as many smaller decisions made differently because a tragedy is remembered. A caver packing for a trip years later might check the forecast more carefully because of stories like Mossdale. A trip leader might cancel a stream cave when storms are possible. A club might insist on a call-out time. A rescue team might train for flood response with more urgency. A landowner might take access rules seriously. A new caver might learn that turning back is not embarrassing. None of those acts brings back the 6 men, but together they form the practical legacy of their loss. They are the ways a community tries to make memory useful without making it small. Mossdale's influence also reaches beyond caving into a wider truth about risk. The natural world does not become safe because people love it. Mountains do not become harmless because climbers are skilled. Rivers do not slow down because canoeists are experienced. Caves do not stop flooding because cavers are careful. Skill matters because the world is not adjusted for us. Planning matters because the world does not negotiate. Humility matters because even experienced people can be caught when conditions change. Mossdale made that humility part of caving's inheritance. There is a strong temptation, after any tragedy, to look for a rule that would prevent all future loss. But outdoor safety is rarely that simple. Rules help. Training helps. Forecasts help. Better gear helps. Rescue organisation helps. Access controls help. Yet the deepest change is the attitude beneath all of them. Mossdale taught cavers to treat water as a deciding force, not a background feature. It taught them to respect the delay between alarm and rescue. It taught them that an entrance can close. It taught them that a cave may be passable at the start and lethal later. It taught them that a team deep inside may be beyond help before anyone outside can reach them. That is why Mossdale remains present in caving culture. Not as a story to repeat for fear alone, but as a measure of seriousness. It asks every later caver to think carefully before entering flood-prone ground. It asks rescue teams to keep preparing for the kind of incidents no one wants to face. It asks clubs to pass on knowledge with honesty. It asks experienced cavers to model caution as much as courage. It asks newcomers to understand that the underground world is not a theme park with poorer lighting. It is real, indifferent, and sometimes unforgiving. The cave under Yorkshire stayed where it was. The beck still moves. The limestone still holds its passages. Rain still falls on the moor. But after 1967, the meaning of those things changed for everyone who knew the story. Mossdale was no longer only a difficult system with a possible connection to Black Keld. It became a permanent reminder that water, weather, and timing can turn exploration into entrapment. The tragedy changed caving not by ending the desire to explore, but by making the desire answer to a harder question. Not simply, what lies beyond, but can we return safely if the cave becomes something else while we are inside? The story of Mossdale does not end in the moment the rescue teams understood that the 6 men were gone. In one sense, that was the end of hope, and there is no softer way to say it. But in another sense, it was the beginning of the long afterlife of the tragedy, the part that moved into memory, safety, access, rescue training, club conversations, and the quiet way cavers still speak about water. Some events do not finish when the immediate emergency is over. They remain in a place. They remain in a community. They remain in the decisions people make years later, when the weather looks uncertain and someone says, "Not today." Mossdale became one of those events. Above the cave, a memorial plaque was fixed to the rock. On the moor, a cairn marks the place above where the bodies were found. These are simple things, stone and metal, but simple things can carry a lot. A plaque does not explain the whole story. A cairn does not describe the sound of floodwater, the exhaustion of rescue teams, or the grief of families, but they give memory a place to stand. They turn a hidden tragedy into something that can be acknowledged in daylight. Without them, Mossdale would still be remembered by cavers, but the landscape itself might seem too quiet, too ordinary, almost unfairly calm. A person walking there could see grass, rock, and open sky, and have no idea that beneath the ground was a story that changed British caving. Memorials matter, especially in places like caves, because caves hide what happens inside them. A mountain accident often leaves a visible slope, a ridge, a weather line, a place people can point to. A sea disaster may have a coastline, a harbour, or a marker looking out over water. A cave accident happens inside the earth, away from sight. The passages keep their own silence. Most people will never see the far marathon crawls or mud caverns, or the routes through Mossdale that became part of the rescue. The memorials above ground do something the cave cannot do by itself. They let the names be met by daylight. Dave Adamson, Jeff Boireau, Bill Frakes, John Ogden, Michael Ryan, and Colin Vickers became tied forever to Mossdale, but they should not be remembered only as victims of a caving disaster. That word, victim, is accurate in one way and incomplete in another. They were cavers. They were young men. They were friends, club members, sons, and people with lives that had not yet reached the places they might have reached. Their ages make the loss feel especially sharp. 17, 19, 20, 23, 24, 26. It is hard to hear those numbers without thinking of unfinished futures. The cave story is why their names are known to strangers now, but each name belonged first to a real life. In 1971, with the agreement of the families, colleagues went back into the system and moved the bodies to Mud Caverns, a chamber deep inside Mossdale. It was a hard task, but also a careful one. The decision to leave them underground had not been made because they were forgotten. It had been made because recovery through the cave was too dangerous. That is a difficult truth, and it still sits heavily in the story. Most people instinctively feel that the dead should be brought home. But Mossdale made that instinct collide with the duty not to risk more lives. A cave that has already taken 6 people cannot be treated as if it owes anyone a safe passage afterward. So their colleagues did what could be done. They entered, moved them, and laid them to rest inside the system. There is a quiet responsibility in that act. It was not dramatic in the ordinary sense. It was not performed for cameras. It was not about adventure or exploration. It was a solemn piece of work carried out by people who understood the cave and understood the men. The underground world that had been their place of exploration became their resting place. That is not an easy thought, but it is part of the truth of Mossdale, and truth in a story like this should not be made too tidy. The cave itself did not become less dangerous because it became famous. That is another important lesson. A tragedy can change human behaviour, but it does not change the geology. Mossdale Beck still runs. Rain still falls. The entrance area remains flood-prone. The passages near the entrance can fill to the roof in flood, and other parts of the system can sump with a small rise in water level. The modern warnings around Mossdale are blunt for a reason. This is not a cave to treat casually. It is not a place where enthusiasm can stand in for judgment. It is a system where weather above ground is part of the route underground, whether a person likes that or not. For years after the accident, access to Mossdale was complicated and often refused. Today, current access guidance is different, but the warning remains severe. That distinction matters. A cave being accessible does not mean it is suitable. No restriction does not mean no risk. A person can be allowed to approach a dangerous place and still need the good sense not to enter it under the wrong conditions. This is a point that reaches far beyond caving. Permission and wisdom are not the same thing. A gate being open does not mean the weather is safe. A map showing a route does not mean the route should be taken today. A cave entrance being visible does not mean it will still be passable when you return. Mossdale's strongest lesson is probably this. The way out must be protected before the way in becomes tempting. That sounds plain, but it is the kind of plain lesson that saves lives. In caving, especially in flood-prone systems, the return journey is not a later problem. It is part of the first decision. The team must ask not only, can we get in, but can we get out if the stream rises? Not only, is it dry now, but what will the catchment do while we're underground? Not only do we know the route, but can the route change behind us? Mossdale showed that the entrance can become the most important part of the cave after it has already disappeared from sight. The tragedy also strengthened the culture of call-outs. A responsible caving trip should leave information with someone outside, who is going, where they're going, what route they expect to take, when they expect to return, and when help should be raised if they do not. This is one of those safety habits that can feel dull when everything goes well, which is most of the time. It may seem like paperwork or a small inconvenience before a trip, but in an emergency, it becomes the thread connecting the underground party to the surface world. Without a clear call-out, delay can grow unnoticed. With one, action can begin sooner. Mossdale's alarm was raised because someone outside the deeper party saw the danger and acted. That first link mattered. Weather judgment became sharper too. Cavers learned and kept learning that weather cannot be treated as a background detail. In stream caves, the forecast is part of the equipment. It is as important as a lamp, a helmet, or a survey. Perhaps more important, because no piece of gear can make a flooded passage breathable. A party can be strong, skilled, and well-equipped, and still be helpless if water fills the route out. 2 dry days before a trip, no rain expected during the trip. Awareness of the catchment and willingness to cancel are not signs of nervousness. They are signs of competence. A caver who cancels because the forecast is uncertain has not failed to be brave. They have understood the cave. Mossdale also taught rescuers about the limits of rescue. That is a painful lesson for any rescue community because rescue is built on the belief that action matters, and action does matter. The Mossdale rescuers worked with extraordinary commitment. More than 300 people were involved. They dug trenches, built dams, diverted water, carried equipment, entered the cave, searched difficult passages, and did everything the conditions allowed. But the flood had already delayed access. The entrance had already become impassable. The cave had already placed the men beyond reach. The rescue was massive, skilled, and determined, and still it could not reverse what the water had done in those first hours. That knowledge has shaped cave rescue thinking ever since. Rescue teams train because they may be needed, but cavers also train and plan so that rescue is less likely to be needed at all. Prevention is not the less exciting cousin of rescue. It is the first rescue. Checking the weather is rescue before the accident. Leaving a call out is rescue before the alarm. Turning back is rescue before the flood. Choosing another cave is rescue before anyone gets cold, trapped, or overdue. Mossdale is one of the reasons those quiet decisions carry so much respect among serious cavers. There is also a lesson about humility. It is easy to think of danger as something that happens to the inexperienced, the careless, or the unlucky in some vague, distant way. Mossdale does not allow that comfort. The men were capable cavers. The cave was known to be severe. The danger was real and understood, yet the storm and flood still created a situation beyond escape. That does not make caution useless. It makes caution more necessary. Skill should not make a person feel immune. Skill should make a person more aware of what they cannot control. The underground world is very good at teaching this, if people listen. A cave does not bend to confidence. It does not widen because someone is strong. It does not drain because someone has experience. It does not provide a phone signal because everyone agrees that would be convenient. A cave is physical reality in a very direct form. Rock, water, air, distance, cold, and time. The human part is planning, judgment, teamwork, and restraint. Mossdale showed what happens when the physical reality changes faster than people can respond. The memorial on the moor does not warn in a loud voice. It does not need to. Its power is in the fact that it is there. A cairn above a cave is a quiet interruption in the landscape. It asks a walker, a caver, or anyone passing by to pause for a moment. It says that something happened here. It says that the ground beneath your feet is not empty. It says that memory can be hidden underground and still matter on the surface. And if the weather is poor, if rain is moving across the high ground, if the beck is running strongly, the message becomes even clearer without changing a word. For families, memorials can never be enough. Nothing built from stone or metal can replace a person. A plaque cannot answer all the questions that grief asks. A cairn cannot return a son, brother, friend, or colleague. But memorials can prevent erasure. They can say at least that the names remain. They can make sure the story is not reduced to a statistic about British caving. 6 died, yes, but 6 people also lived before that day, and the community that remembers them has a duty to keep their names attached to care, not curiosity alone. For cavers, the memorial carries a second responsibility. It is not only a place of remembrance, it is a warning that must be acted on. To remember Mossdale properly is not merely to feel sad when hearing the story. It is to make different choices when water, weather and judgment are involved. It is to teach new cavers why flood-prone systems deserve caution. It is to speak honestly about serious caves. It is to respect rescue teams by not making them face avoidable call-outs. It is to understand that the underground world can be beautiful, fascinating, and dangerous at the same time. That balance is important. Mossdale should not make us speak of caving only as horror. Caves are remarkable places. They hold geology, underground rivers, rare formations, hidden ecosystems, and roots that tell the story of a water moving through the earth. Caving has produced science, friendship, exploration, and rescue communities of great skill and generosity. It is not reckless by nature, but it is serious by nature. Mossdale reminds us not to confuse those two things. A serious activity can be done responsibly. A dangerous cave can be respected. A tragedy can be remembered without turning the whole sport into a warning sign. At the same time, Mossdale should not be softened into just another historical anecdote. It was Britain's worst caving tragedy. 6 young men died. Their bodies remained underground. The entrance was sealed. Families grieved. Rescuers carried memories of the operation. The caving community changed because it had to. These facts are hard, and they should stay hard enough to teach. A story like this loses its purpose if it becomes only atmosphere. The point is not to be frightened for a few minutes and then move on. The point is to understand how water, weather, timing and judgment can meet underground, and why the lessons paid for at Mossdale still matter. So when modern cavers talk about Mossdale, they are not only talking about a place in Yorkshire, they are talking about a boundary in the mind, a line between curiosity and caution, a reminder that a long underground trip begins before anyone reaches the entrance. It begins with the forecast, the route plan, the call-out, the condition of the stream, the experience of the team, and the willingness to walk away. It begins with the humility to say that the cave has no obligation to be safe today. And now, after all of this, we come back to the quiet. The moor above Mossdale is still there. The limestone is still there. The beck still finds its way toward the dark. The cave below remains part of the hidden drainage of the dales, shaped by water over timescales far longer than any human life. But the place is not only geology anymore. It is memory. It is lesson. It is warning. It is grief held in rock and marked in stone above. If you are listening late at night, perhaps the world around you is very still now. Maybe there is no rain where you are. Maybe there is only the small sound of a room settling, a distant car, or your own breathing becoming slower. Stories like Mossdale ask for a different kind of attention. Not excitement, not fear for its own sake, just care. Care for the people who are lost. Care for the rescuers who tried to reach them. Care for the families who carried the loss afterward. Care for those who still enter caves and must decide each time whether the conditions are right, whether the water is low, whether the sky can be trusted, and whether the safest adventure is the one postponed. And if this story has held your attention, or given you a quieter respect for the unseen places beneath our feet, I would be grateful if you liked the video, subscribed, and shared this calm space with someone who enjoys careful stories from the edges of science, history, and the natural world. Mossdale is not an easy story, but it is an important one. It reminds us that curiosity should travel with humility, that rescue begins long before an alarm is raised, and that sometimes the most powerful lessons are left not in books but in landscapes, in names, and in the silence below.